Hey guys, and welcome to another session of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we begin with a question that peels back the shiny veneer of chivalry. Why exactly did it suck to be a knight? Let's talk about the smell. Imagine wearing the same thick, padded tunic under that steel for weeks. Add sweat, rain, horse, and the general lack of medieval hygiene. You are a walking, clanking biohazard. Let's consider the environmental impact of the Emu War. It was, at its heart, a conflict between agriculture and a native ecosystem. The farming practices of the time were turning a landscape that had been shaped by millennia of emu migration into something new. The emus were not the aggressors. They were simply interacting with their environment as they always had. The new wheat fields were an irresistible, high-energy food source that disrupted their normal patterns. The war was a symptom of this larger ecological clash. The ultimate solution, the fences, was a physical manifestation of this conflict, a line drawn on the earth to separate the human world of agriculture from the natural world of the emus. It's a story that continues to play out all over the world today. Let's reflect on the very act of naming something a war. By calling the culling operation the Great Emu War, the participants and the media gave it a narrative structure. It had two sides, battles, a winner and a loser. This framing is what makes it a story. If it had been called the 1932 Avian Pest Abatement Program, it would have been forgotten. The name itself is an act of storytelling. It imbues a mundane, if bizarre, event with a sense of epic, comical grandeur. It's a reminder that the words we choose to describe events have immense power. They can turn a pest control failure into a legendary conflict that we are still talking about, and relaxing to, almost a century later. A fork's journey can be seen as a taming of the mouth. Before the fork, the mouth was a more active participant in the act of eating, tearing, gnawing, and being closer to the food. The fork civilizes the process, keeping the wildness of the meal at a distance. It's part of a broader civilizing process, as the sociologist Norbert Elias called it, a long-term trend in European history towards greater emotional restraint and bodily control. Table manners became more elaborate, bodily functions were hidden, and violence was more regulated. The fork is a small, everyday object that played a role in this grand, centuries-long shift in how people behaved, both in public and in private. It helped to create the modern sense of a refined, controlled self. The Voynich manuscript's drawings of castles are an interesting detail. In the astronomical section, one of the diagrams, possibly representing a zodiac, is ringed by little towers and fortifications. There's also a single, full-page drawing of what looks like a city or a castle with swallow-tailed merlons, a specific type of fortification architecture common in northern Italy in the 15th century. This is one of the few tangible clues in the manuscript that links it to a specific time and place. It's a tiny anchor of reality in a sea of fantasy. It suggests that the author, for all their fantastical imagination, was still a product of their time, observing the world around them and incorporating its details into their own secret universe. The squires who served the knights had a difficult and often thankless job. They were teenagers, burdened with immense responsibility. In battle, a squire had to stay close to his knight, but he was usually more lightly armored and more vulnerable. His job was to bring his knight a fresh horse, a new lance, or to help him if he was unhorsed. It required courage and loyalty. A squire's greatest hope was to perform so bravely and competently that he would be knighted himself on the battlefield. This was the ultimate recognition, the culmination of years of hard service. But for every squire who achieved this dream, there were many others who were injured, killed, or simply never got the chance to rise, remaining in a state of perpetual apprenticeship. The concept of honor was the central pillar of a knight's identity. But it was a slippery and dangerous idea. A knight's honor was tied to his reputation for courage, loyalty, and piety. An insult, even a minor one, could be seen as a challenge to his honor that had to be answered, often with violence. This created a culture of touchiness and paranoia, where men were constantly on guard against any perceived slight. The duel, a formal combat to settle a point of honor, was a common outcome. This rigid code, which was meant to regulate behavior, could also lead to pointless violence and blood feuds that could last for generations. The pressure to maintain one's honor was a constant, life-or-death source of stress. The economic fallout of the Emu War was minimal for the government, but significant for the narrative. The cost of the ammunition, the soldiers, pay, and the transport was not huge, but it was taxpayers' money. The fact that this money was spent on a failed attempt to shoot birds provided an easy line of attack for opposition politicians. It became a symbol of wasteful government spending. In the midst of the Great Depression, every penny counted, and the image of the government firing thousands of rounds of ammunition at fleeing birds was not a good look. The war was not just a military failure, but a political one, a self-inflicted wound that made the government look both incompetent and out of touch with the struggles of its people. Let's consider the fork's journey from west to east. While the fork was slowly conquering Europe, many cultures in Asia were developing their own sophisticated dining technology, chopsticks. The two inventions represent different solutions to the same problem. Chopsticks are an extension of the fingers, requiring dexterity and precision. The fork is a tool for stabbing and scooping, requiring less fine motor skill. The global spread of Western culture has led to the fork becoming a nearly universal utensil, but chopsticks remain the primary tool for billions of people. The two objects represent two distinct culinary philosophies, two different ways of approaching the simple, universal act of bringing food to the mouth. The fork's story is a Western one, and it's important to remember it's not the only story. The physical object of the Voynich manuscript is now quite fragile. The vellum is brittle, the ink is faded in places, and the binding is delicate. The librarians at the Beinecke Library handle it with extreme care, under controlled lighting and climate conditions. Its fragility is a poignant reminder of the passage of time. This book has survived for 600 years. It has survived wars, fires, and the slow decay of centuries. Its persistence is a small miracle. It is a time capsule from a lost world, and its physical vulnerability makes its intellectual mystery all the more precious. We may never know what it says, but we have a duty to preserve the beautiful, silent question that it asks. The Crusades represent the ultimate expression of the knightly ideal, and also its greatest contradiction. Knights were encouraged by the Church to travel thousands of miles to fight in the Holy Land. It was presented as the highest form of Christian service, a holy war. In reality, the Crusades were complex events, driven by a mixture of religious fervor, political ambition, and a desire for land and wealth. Many knights who went on crusade were younger sons with no inheritance, seeking to carve out a kingdom for themselves in the East. The brutal reality of the Crusades, the massacres, the political infighting, the clashing of cultures, was a world away from the pure, chivalrous quest that was preached from the pulpits of Europe. The grand feasts you pictured are few and far between. Your campaign diet consists of hardtack that could break a tooth, salted meat of questionable origin, and weak, sour ale. It's less a feast and more a caloric transaction to keep you moving. Let's think about the end of the Age of Knights. The heavily armored knight on his warhorse dominated the battlefields of Europe for centuries. But new technologies emerged that would make him obsolete. The longbow, with its ability to pierce armor at a distance, was a major threat. But the true game-changer was gunpowder. Early firearms were clumsy and inaccurate, but they could punch through the finest plate armor. A peasant with a simple gun could defeat a knight who had trained his entire life for battle. This technological shift led to a military revolution. The castle became vulnerable to cannon fire, and the armored knight became a slow-moving target. The age of chivalry didn't end because of a change in ideals. It ended because of a change in technology. The choice of Lewis guns for the Emu War is an interesting detail. The Lewis gun was a light machine gun, famous for its use in World War I, often mounted on aircraft. It was a reliable and effective weapon of war. Using it against birds was the ultimate example of overkill. It's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The very choice of weapon highlights the military mindset that was brought to the problem. They saw the emus as an enemy force to be suppressed with overwhelming firepower. They failed to appreciate that the principles of warfare that work against a human army, concentrated fire, fixed positions, predictable movements, are completely useless against a flock of fast-moving, randomly scattering animals. The weapon was perfect. The strategy was a complete failure. The spork, That hybrid of a spoon and fork is a modern epilogue to the fork's long history. It represents a return to utilitarian simplicity. In a world of fast food and casual dining, the complex etiquette of the Victorian dinner table seems absurd. The spork is the anti-fork. It has no pretense. It is a single efficient tool for conveying any kind of food to the mouth. It is the triumph of function over form. While it's often seen as a cheap, disposable object, it's also a clever piece of design. In a way, it's a throwback to the pre-fork era, when a single tool, like a spoon, was expected to do multiple jobs. The spork's quiet existence is a humble testament to our ongoing, ever-evolving relationship with the simple act of eating. There's a theory that the Voynich manuscript is a, quote, constructed language or conlang. This is a language that has been consciously invented, like Esperanto or the Elvish languages of J.R.R. Tolkien. Creating a convincing conlang is an immense intellectual achievement. It requires a deep understanding of linguistics to create a consistent grammar, vocabulary, and phonology. If Voynichese is a conlang, its creator was a linguistic genius, centuries ahead of their time. It might have been created for a secret society, or as a philosophical project to create a perfect, logical language, or simply as a work of art. This theory elevates the author from a mere scribe or hoaxer to a visionary creator, a Tolkien of the 15th century whose fiction was so complete that we are still unable to distinguish it from fact. The heraldry of a knight was his personal brand. Every knight had a unique coat of arms, a set of symbols and colors displayed on his shield and banner. This was not just decoration. It was a vital system of identification on the battlefield. In the chaos of a fight, with everyone wearing helmets that covered their faces, heraldry was the only way to tell friend from foe. It was also a visual representation of a knight's lineage and alliances. The complex rules of heraldry, what colors could be used, how symbols could be combined, formed a visual language understood by the entire noble class. A knight's coat of arms was his signature, a proud declaration of who he was in a world of clashing steel and concealed identities. The concept of feudalism, the system that supported the knight, was based on a pyramid of personal loyalties. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land. They owed loyalty and service to their local knight. The knight, in turn, owed loyalty and military service to a greater lord, a baron or an earl. That lord owed loyalty to the king. It was a system of mutual obligation, land for service. In theory, it was a neat and tidy structure. In reality, it was a messy and often unstable system. Loyalties were frequently divided, and lords often rebelled against their kings. A knight was often caught in the middle of these power struggles, forced to choose which side to support, a decision that could easily cost him his land, his title, and his life. The aftermath of the Emu War had a small but lasting impact on Australian military doctrine. While it's a comical story, it provided a real-world, if bizarre, lesson in the limitations of conventional military tactics against an unconventional, highly mobile target. The principles learned in the feudal chase of the emus, the difficulty of targeting scattered, fast-moving groups, the uselessness of heavy firepower without proper targeting, have echoes in modern counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare theory. Of course, no military analyst would ever officially cite the Emu War as a case study, but the lessons were there. The emus, in their own chaotic way, provided a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a lesson the Australian Army learned the hard and very embarrassing way. The fork's journey is not over. As global food cultures continue to blend, our utensils continue to adapt. The rise in popularity of Asian noodle soups, like ramen and pho, in the West, has led to the common sight of a fork and a spoon being used together, or a diner awkwardly trying to use chopsticks. The ideal set of utensils depends entirely on the meal. This is leading to a more fluid and less dogmatic approach to table settings. The rigid rules of the Victorian era are giving way to a more practical, multicultural approach. The future of dining might not be one dominant tool, but a flexible toolkit, where the fork, the spoon, and chopsticks all coexist peacefully in the same kitchen drawer, each waiting for the right meal to shine. The Voynich manuscript has a peculiar effect on those who study it. It has become a kind of intellectual obsession for many, a Voynich curse. People have dedicated their lives and careers to deciphering it, often at great personal cost. the manuscript's resistance to interpretation can be maddening. It dangles the promise of a profound secret, a lost world of knowledge, but never delivers. This has led some researchers down bizarre rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and numerological fantasies. It acts as a sort of intellectual gravity well, pulling people in with its mystery. Its greatest secret may be its ability to captivate and consume the very people who are trying to solve it. It is a book that reads its readers. Let's consider the justice system for a knight. If a knight was accused of a crime, he could sometimes choose to be judged by trial by combat. This was a formal duel, in which the winner was deemed to be innocent, as God would supposedly have favored the righteous. It was a legal process rooted in violence and superstition. This option was only available to the noble class. A peasant accused of a crime would face a more conventional trial, or perhaps a like being forced to carry a hot iron, where healing without infection was seen as a sign of innocence. The legal system of the Middle Ages was deeply stratified. The justice you received depended entirely on your social class. For a knight, might and right were often considered to be one and the same. And the boredom. Oh, the soul-crushing boredom. War isn't constant battle. It's 99% marching, waiting, cleaning your gear, and staring at a damp field, followed by 1% of sheer, unadulterated terror. The decline of the knightly class was a slow and complex process. It wasn't just about gunpowder. The rise of centralized monarchies, with their own professional, standing armies, reduced the reliance on feudal levies of knights. Kings preferred to hire mercenary soldiers who were loyal to them because they were paid, not because of a complex web of feudal obligation. The economics of warfare changed. It became cheaper and more effective to field a large army of infantry with pikes and guns than a small force of expensive knights. The knight did not disappear overnight. He transitioned from a warrior into a courtier, a country gentleman. His armor became ceremonial, worn in parades instead of battles. The age of the knight faded away, leaving behind a powerful and enduring myth. One of the unsung heroes, or perhaps victims, of the Great Emu War was the newsreel cameraman from Fox Movietone. He went into the field expecting to capture footage of a decisive victory, a thrilling display of military prowess. Instead, he got nothing. His camera was heavy and clumsy. The emus were too fast and too far away. The most dramatic event he witnessed was the gun jamming. He returned with footage that was essentially unusable for the patriotic propaganda piece he was sent to create. His failure to capture the action is, in a way, a perfect metaphor for the entire campaign. The war was unfilmable because it was a non-event, a series of frustrating failures that refused to conform to a dramatic narrative. The simple act of holding a fork correctly became a mark of good breeding. The continental style, where the fork is held in the left hand with the tines down, versus the American cut-and-switch method, became a subtle class and cultural signifier. Books of etiquette from the 19th and 20th centuries are filled with detailed instructions and diagrams on the proper handling of cutlery. These rules seem arbitrary and silly to us now, but they were taken very seriously. They were part of a complex system of social codes that allowed people to judge each other's background and education at a glance. The fork, an object that was once a symbol of rebellion, had become a tool of social conformity, its use governed by a new and powerful set of unwritten laws. The Voynich manuscript's illustrations of women have led to some fascinating, if fringe, theories. One idea is that the manuscript was created by a religious community, perhaps a heretical Cathar sect, where women played a more central role. The bathing scenes could be symbolic representations of spiritual purification or baptismal rites. The strange plumbing could be a map of a spiritual journey. This theory casts the manuscript not as a work of science or magic, but as a sacred text of a lost religion. It's an appealing idea because it gives the manuscript a profound purpose. But like all other theories, it remains pure speculation, a story we tell to fill the silence that the manuscript leaves behind. The armor of a knight was a remarkable piece of technology for its time. A full suit of articulated plate armor from the 15th century was a masterpiece of metallurgy and design. It was engineered to deflect blows and distribute impact, with overlapping plates and flexible joints. A well-made suit did not restrict movement as much as one might think. A knight in full armor could still mount a horse, swing a sword, and even do a somersault. However, it was incredibly hot and stuffy, and it required constant maintenance to prevent rust. It was the personal protective equipment of its day, a sophisticated but burdensome solution to the problem of surviving on a medieval battlefield. The Shining Knight was, in essence, an early cyborg, a man encased in a metal exoskeleton. The relationship between a knight and his squire was one of mentorship and deep personal service. The squire was not just a servant, he was a student. He learned the arts of war by observing his knight, by caring for his equipment, and by assisting him in battle. It was a bond of trust and interdependence. A good squire could save his knight's life. A good knight could make his squire's career. This master-apprentice relationship was the primary way that the skills and values of the knightly class were passed down through the generations. It was a deeply personal and practical education, a world away from the formal, classroom-based learning we are used to today. The Australian landscape itself was a key player in the Emu War. The vast, open spaces and the tough, scrubby vegetation gave the emus a home field advantage. They knew the terrain. The military vehicles struggled with the rough ground. The soldiers, used to the battlefields of Europe, were in an alien environment. The heat, the dust, and the sheer scale of the outback were all factors that worked against them. The war was not just a contest between soldiers and birds. It was a contest between a conventional army and an entire ecosystem. And the ecosystem, as it so often does, won. The landscape was not a neutral backdrop. It was an active participant in the emu's victory. The story of the fork has a final, ironic twist. After centuries of being seen as an Italian affectation, the fork became synonymous with good manners in England and America. But in Italy, the home of the fork, dining often remained a more relaxed affair. The elaborate rules and specialized forks of the Victorian era never took hold with the same intensity. Even today, it's not uncommon in a rustic Italian trattoria to see someone use their knife to push pasta onto their fork, a move that would make a Victorian etiquette master faint. The fork's journey came full circle. The culture that invented it was less obsessed with its formal rules than the cultures that reluctantly adopted it. It's a gentle reminder that the originators of a trend are often the most relaxed about its execution. One of the most compelling aspects of the Voynich manuscript is the simple fact of its survival. So many books from the 15th century have been lost. They were destroyed in fires, wars, or floods. They were eaten by insects or simply fell apart from neglect. Vellum was often scraped clean and reused for a new text, creating a palimpsest. The fact that this particular book, with its strange and useless content, was preserved for 6 centuries is remarkable. Someone, at every stage of its journey, must have looked at it and decided it was worth saving, even if they couldn't understand it. Its mystery was its own preservation society. The book's stubborn refusal to be understood is the very reason it still exists. The concept of a just war was a major concern for medieval theologians, and it directly impacted the knight. Thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas laid out criteria for a war to be morally permissible. It had to be declared by a legitimate authority, have a just cause, like self-defense, and be fought with the right intention. Knights were, in theory, supposed to fight only in such wars. This provided a theological justification for their violent profession. However, the lines were often blurry, and propaganda was common. A war of pure aggression could easily be framed as a just defense of one's rights. The knight was often a pawn in these larger political games. His sword lent to causes whose justice was debatable at best. You spend weeks on end playing dice games with men you don't particularly like, nursing a lukewarm drink, and wondering if this is all there is. The epic poems conveniently leave out the endless, mind-numbing stretches of absolutely nothing happening. Let's consider the entertainment of a knight. When not at war or managing his estate, a knight needed to pass the time. Hunting and hawking were popular pastimes, both a sport and a source of food. Indoors, chess was an incredibly popular game among the nobility, seen as a metaphor for strategy and warfare. Dice and card games were also common, though often frowned upon by the church as an invitation to gambling and vice. Traveling minstrels and troubadours would visit castles, performing epic poems, songs of courtly love, and stories of heroic deeds. This entertainment both reflected and reinforced the values of the knightly class, creating a shared culture of stories, games, and pastimes. The humor of the Great Emu War is a very dry, very Australian kind of humor. It's a humor based on understatement, irony, and a healthy skepticism of authority. The newspaper reports of the time are a masterclass in this style. They report the facts of the military's failure with a straight face, letting the absurdity of the situation speak for itself. This laconic, deadpan wit is a key part of the Australian national identity. The Emu War is not just a funny story, it's a story that is funny in a particularly Australian way. It's a tale of battlers, both human and avian, and a gentle mockery of officialdom's grand plans coming to nothing in the vast, unforgiving outback. The modern disposable fork is a symbol of our contemporary culture, just as the golden fork of the Byzantine princess was a symbol of hers. The plastic fork speaks of convenience, speed, and a throwaway society. It is designed for a single use, a fleeting interaction with a meal eaten on the go. It represents a complete departure from the fork as a precious, permanent object, a family heirloom passed down through generations. Its very disposability is a statement about our relationship with our possessions and our food. It is the logical endpoint of the fork's journey, from a sacred, scandalous object to a mundane, ubiquitous, and ultimately ephemeral tool. The calligraphy of the Voynich manuscript is one of its most studied features. The script is not written haphazardly. It shows the characteristics of a practiced hand. The letters are formed consistently, the spacing is regular, and the lines of text are straight. Some linguists have even identified what appear to be different handwriting styles in the book, suggesting it might have been written by more than one scribe. This level of care and professionalism is one of the strongest arguments against it being a simple, meaningless hoax. It looks and feels like a real book, produced by trained scribes in a professional scriptorium. But what scriptorium produced a book in a language that no one had ever seen before or has ever seen since? That is the question. The healthcare available to a knight was rudimentary and often dangerous. Medical knowledge was a mixture of folk remedies, herbalism, and the theory of the four humors derived from ancient Greece. Surgery was brutal and unhygienic, performed by barber surgeons whose primary skill was cutting. Infection was the greatest danger. A wound that would be minor today could easily become fatal. Cauterization, searing a wound with a hot iron, was a common method to stop bleeding and was as agonizing as it sounds. The best a knight could hope for was a strong constitution and a great deal of luck. The shining armor provided protection from swords, but it was no defense against the invisible enemies of bacteria and disease. The castle, while a symbol of power, was also a trap. During a siege, a knight and his household could be trapped inside for weeks or months. A siege was a battle of attrition. The attackers would try to starve the defenders out, or to undermine the walls, or to use siege engines like catapults and trebuchets to batter the fortifications. Life inside a besieged castle was grim. Food and water would be strictly rationed. Disease would spread quickly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. It was a stressful, claustrophobic existence, a waiting game where the stakes were life and death. The castle was both a knight's greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability. The emu's invulnerability, as described by Major Meredith, is an interesting piece of battlefield observation. Emus have very thick skin and a dense layer of feathers, which likely did offer some protection against the small caliber bullets of the Lewis gun, especially at longer ranges. But their real defense was their speed and chaotic movement. Meredith's comment about them being like tanks was, of course, hyperbole born of frustration. But it speaks to the psychological impact they had on the soldiers. The birds' simple refusal to die in a convenient, predictable manner made them seem preternaturally tough. The legend of the bulletproof emu is a testament to the power of a frustrated soldier's imagination. Let's consider the fork's role in cinema and television. In historical dramas, the presence or absence of a fork can be a subtle but powerful historical marker. A scene set in a medieval banquet will show people eating with their hands to establish authenticity. A scene in a Victorian drama will focus on the complex array of silverware to signal the rigid social codes of the era. The fork has become a piece of cinematic shorthand, a simple prop that can instantly communicate a wealth of information about the time period, the social class, and the cultural context of the characters. It's a silent actor on the dinner table, playing its small part in the storytelling. The modern attempts to use AI to decipher the Voynich manuscript are a fascinating new chapter in its story. The hope is that a machine, unburdened by human linguistic biases, can find the underlying structure. But this raises a philosophical question. If an AI were to solve it, what would that mean? If it found a statistical correlation with a lost dialect of Turkish but we still couldn't read the words, would that be a solution? Or if it generated a translation that was poetic but nonsensical, what would we have learned? The quest to decipher the manuscript is not just about finding an answer. It's about defining what a satisfactory answer would even look like for a puzzle this deep and this strange. The pageantry of knighthood was a crucial part of its power. The ceremony of dubbing, where a squire was made a knight, was a solemn and significant ritual. The elaborate tournaments, the bright heraldry, the code of chivalry, all of this was a form of political theater. It created an aura of mystique and authority around the warrior class. It was a way of justifying their privileged position in society. By presenting themselves as a special elite brotherhood, bound by honor and piety, knights reinforced their own power. The suck of being a knight was the hard, dirty work required to maintain this beautiful, elaborate, and ultimately fragile illusion of superiority. Sickness is a far more likely killer than a sword. A simple cut from your own dagger can get infected, leading to a fever that no one knows how to treat. And dysentery, well, dysentery is the great unifier of all medieval armies. A knight's diet, when not on campaign, was heavily meat-based. The nobility consumed vast quantities of meat and fish, a sign of their wealth and status. The peasant diet, by contrast, was mostly bread, grains, and vegetables. A feast in a great hall would feature multiple courses of roasted meats: boar, venison, swan, peacock, often elaborately prepared and seasoned with expensive imported spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. This rich, heavy diet, combined with a lifestyle that could be sedentary when not at war, likely contributed to health problems like gout, which was common among the upper classes. The knight's feast was a display of power, but it was not necessarily a recipe for a long and healthy life. The Great Emu War has become a popular internet meme, finding a new life in the 21st century. Its story is perfectly suited for the internet. It's short, bizarre, and has a clear underdog winner. It's a shareable piece of trivia that encapsulates a feeling of absurd failure. This modern revival has introduced the story to a whole new generation, far removed from 1930s Australia. The war's legacy is no longer just in the history books. It's in the shared cultural language of the internet, a universally understood reference for any situation where a well-laid plan goes comically, spectacularly wrong. The emus have achieved a new kind of immortality, not just in the fields of Western Australia, but in the digital ether. The fork's journey is a lesson in the normalization of the strange. Every object and custom that we consider normal today was, at some point, new, strange, and possibly controversial. The fork is a particularly dramatic example, but the pattern is universal. From coffee and potatoes, which were once viewed with suspicion, to technologies like the telephone or the internet, which were initially met with skepticism, new things must overcome our innate resistance to change. The fork's story is a quiet reminder that the world is in a constant state of flux, and the weird habits of today may well become the unremarkable common sense of tomorrow. It encourages a little more patience and a little less judgment towards things that are new and different. The Voynich manuscript's blank pages are a mystery in themselves. There are several pages at the end of the book that are empty. There are also gaps in the page numbering, suggesting that some pages may have been lost over the centuries. What was on these missing pages? Did they contain a key to the cipher? Did they hold the most important secrets of the entire book? Or were they simply left blank by the author? This absence, this missing information, only adds to the manuscript's tantalizing nature. It's a puzzle with missing pieces, which makes it even harder, and perhaps even more tempting to try and solve. The very structure of the book is an enigma. The Brotherhood of Arms was a powerful concept for knights. Knights who fought together in a campaign often formed deep bonds, a sense of camaraderie forged in shared hardship and danger. This could lead to formal associations, or orders of chivalry, like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller. These were military religious organizations that combined the ideals of a monk and a warrior. Other orders were secular, founded by kings to bind their most important nobles to them in a fellowship of honor. These brotherhoods created a network of alliances and a shared identity that transcended local loyalties, creating a truly international knightly class that stretched across all of Christian Europe. The relationship between a knight and the peasants who lived on his land was one of power and dependence. The peasants worked the land, and in return, the knight offered them protection from bandits, from other lords, and from the chaos of war. It was a system of mutual, but highly unequal, obligation. The knight was the landlord, the judge, and the military commander. The peasants had few rights and were tied to the land. While some lords were benevolent, many were harsh and exploitative. The life of a peasant was one of constant, back-breaking labor, with little hope of social mobility. The knight's comfortable lifestyle was built directly on the sweat and toil of the people who worked his fields. The final, quiet end of the Emu War was the bounty system. It was a less dramatic, but far more effective solution. It decentralized the effort, turning it from a military operation into a freelance gig. Anyone with a gun and some time could go out and hunt emus for a small reward. This approach was more adaptable and persistent than the military's brief, clumsy campaign. It's a classic example of how a distributed, incentive-based system can sometimes solve a problem more effectively than a top-down command and control approach. The war ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, gradual application of local knowledge and economic self-interest. The emus didn't stand a chance against capitalism. Let's consider the sensory experience of eating with a fork for the first time. Imagine you have spent your entire life eating with your hands and a spoon. The feeling of the cold, hard tines of the fork against your lips and tongue would be alien. The precision required to spear a piece of food rather than grabbing it would feel fussy and unnatural. The sound of the fork scraping against a plate would be a new and perhaps jarring addition to the soundscape of the meal. The adoption of the fork required a re-education of the senses. It demanded a new kind of physical interaction with food, a more distant and mediated experience. It's a small change that represents a profound shift in the very feeling of eating. The Voynich manuscript is a humbling object for the human intellect. In an age where we have mapped the human genome, photographed black holes, and sent rovers to Mars, this small 600-year-old book remains completely opaque. It is a testament to the fact that for all our knowledge and technology, there are still fundamental mysteries that we cannot penetrate. It resists our cleverness. It sits in its glass case at Yale, silently mocking our assumption that everything is ultimately knowable. It's a valuable and strangely comforting reminder that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us. Some things may simply remain a mystery, and there is a deep and quiet beauty in that. The legacy of the knight is all around us, even if we don't recognize it. The language of chivalry, terms like gallantry, courtesy, and honor, is still part of our vocabulary. The imagery of the knight in shining armor is a powerful and enduring archetype in our stories, from fantasy novels to superhero movies. The castle is a staple of fairy tales and a major tourist attraction. We have inherited the romanticized myth of the knight, not the messy reality. This myth continues to shape our ideals of heroism, honor, and romance. The knight may be long gone, but his ghost, polished and shining, still haunts our collective imagination. The battlefield is not a stage for heroics, it's a muddy, chaotic scrum. You can't see more than 5 feet in front of you. The noise of screaming men and clashing steel is deafening. Your main goal is to not trip and get trampled. Let's end our journey with the knight in a moment of quiet reflection. Imagine him at the end of a long day, sitting by the fire in his great hall. His armor is being cleaned by his squire. His wounds ache. He is worried about the harvest, about a political dispute with a neighbor, about the cost of his daughter's upcoming wedding. The epic poems and songs of glory seem very far away. In this quiet moment, he is not a myth or a symbol. He is just a man, burdened by the immense weight of his responsibilities, financial, social, and military. It was, in so many ways, a very hard life. And as we drift off to sleep in our own comfortable, modern world, we can perhaps appreciate the simple peace that he so rarely knew. As we settle deeper into our rest, let's allow our thoughts to drift back to the sun-baked plains of Australia. The Great Emu War, for all its humor, serves as a profound allegory for humanity's relationship with the natural world. The military, with its structured command, its advanced technology, and its clear objectives, represented the height of human order and intention. They arrived with a plan, a belief that the world could be bent to their will through force and logic. The emus, on the other hand, represented the chaos, the unpredictability, and the deep, instinctual resilience of nature itself. They had no plan, no strategy, no commander. They simply were. And in the end, their chaotic, mindless being was more effective than all the focused, mindful planning of the humans. It's a lesson in humility, a reminder that the world is not a machine to be controlled, but a wild, living system to which we belong. Consider the perspective of the individual soldiers in the Emu War, Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran. They were professional soldiers, veterans of the First World War. They had likely seen the horrors of trench warfare and witnessed the devastating power of the Lewis gun when used against human targets. To then be deployed to the outback and ordered to turn this same weapon on a flock of birds must have felt surreal, perhaps even insulting. Their frustration, as documented in Major Meredith's reports, is palpable. They were using a tool of immense destructive power, but it was the wrong tool for the job. Their experience is a small-scale tragedy of expertise misapplied, of skills honed for one kind of conflict being utterly useless in another. They were warriors, reduced to the role of pest controllers and failing even at that. The political fallout of the Great Emu War offers a timeless lesson in public administration. The decision to send in the army was a classic example of a, quote, symbolic policy. It was designed to show the desperate farmers that the government was taking their problems seriously. The actual effectiveness of the solution was secondary to the appearance of taking action. When the action failed so spectacularly, the government was left looking foolish. It's a cautionary tale for any leader. Sometimes, the best action is no action at all, and a grand public gesture can easily backfire if it is not rooted in a practical understanding of the problem. The Emu War is a masterclass in what not to do when faced with a public crisis, a lesson written in the dusty footprints of 20,000 victorious birds. Let's turn our attention back to the dinner table and the quiet revolution of the fork. The resistance to the fork, especially from the clergy, was rooted in a deep fear of the foreign and the new. The fork came from the Byzantine East, a culture that was seen by many in the Catholic West as decadent, effeminate, and suspiciously sophisticated. The condemnation of the fork was not just about table manners, it was about cultural purity. It was a rejection of foreign influence. St. Peter Damian's attack on the Byzantine princess was an attack on her entire culture, symbolized by her strange golden eating tool. This xenophobic reaction to a new object is a pattern that has repeated throughout history. The fork's eventual acceptance is a story of globalization in miniature, a slow, centuries-long process of one culture's strange habit becoming another's daily norm. The fork's journey is also a story about the human body. The pre-fork world was a world of more direct sensory engagement with food. The texture of bread, the heat of the meat, the slipperiness of a vegetable, all were felt directly with the hands. The fork created a distance, mediating the relationship between the body and the food. This can be seen as part of a larger historical trend of disembodying our experiences. We listen to music through headphones rather than in a concert hall. We interact with people through screens rather than face-to-face. The fork was an early step on this path, a piece of technology that promised cleanliness and refinement, but at the cost of a certain kind of direct, physical connection to the world. It made eating less of a tactile experience and more of a visual and mechanical one. The sheer variety of forks that emerged in the Victorian era is a testament to the human love of categorization and rules. There were luncheon forks, dinner forks, fish forks, oyster forks, salad forks, dessert forks, pastry forks, and even specialized forks for eating terrapins or mangoes. This wasn't about necessity. It was about creating a complex system of etiquette that could be used to signal social status. To own and correctly use this vast arsenal of silverware was to demonstrate your wealth, your sophistication, and your knowledge of the proper way to do things. It was a form of conspicuous consumption, a way of turning the simple act of eating into a performance of social superiority. The fork, once a symbol of sin, had become a weapon in the quiet, merciless wars of class distinction. Let us return one last time to the deep, quiet mystery of the Voynich manuscript. Let's focus on the feeling it evokes. It is a feeling of profound intellectual vertigo. To look at its pages is to stand at the edge of a great abyss of meaning. We see all the familiar signs of language, letters, words, sentences, paragraphs, but the meaning itself is absent. It is like looking at a photograph of a city you have never seen, where you can recognize buildings and streets, but you have no idea of the life that is lived there. This feeling, this mixture of familiarity and complete alienation, is what makes the manuscript so uniquely captivating. It is a perfect enigma, a message in a bottle written in a language that might as well be from another dimension. The theory that the Voynich manuscript is an example of outsider art is one of the most compelling, because it requires no grand conspiracy or lost civilization. It only requires one person, with a unique mind and a singular vision. Outsider artists are, by definition, people who are not part of the established art world. They create for themselves, driven by an intense personal need to express their own private reality. Their work is often intricate, obsessive, and follows its own internal logic. The Voynich manuscript fits this profile perfectly. It could be the life's work of a reclusive mystic, a visionary, or someone we might today diagnose with a complex mental health condition. In this view, trying to decode it is like trying to find a rational explanation for a dream. The point is not the logic, but the strange and beautiful vision itself. Let's consider the plants in the Voynich manuscript once more. While most are unidentifiable, a few seem to bear a passing resemblance to real-world plants, but with strange additions. This has led to a theory that the book is not a straightforward herbal, but an alchemical one. In alchemy, plants were often used as symbols. A common plant might be drawn in a fantastical way to represent a philosophical concept or a stage in an alchemical process. The impossible roots, the strange flowers, the composite nature of the plants, all of this could be a symbolic language. The book might be a guide to creating elixirs, but the elixirs might be for the soul, not the body. The plants might be ingredients in a recipe for spiritual enlightenment, a map of the inner world disguised as a book about the outer one. The elegant sword fights of cinema are a myth. Real combat is brutish and quick. It's about finding a gap in the armor, the armpit, the groin, the eye slit, and shoving something sharp into it. It's clumsy, desperate, and horrifying. Let's imagine the moment of the manuscript's creation. A quiet room in a 15th century monastery or workshop. The only sounds are the scratching of a quill pen on vellum and the rustle of the pages. The author, or scribe, is bent over their work, their mind filled with these strange images and this unique language. What was their motivation? Were they recording a sacred vision? Were they creating a puzzle to confound future generations? Were they meticulously crafting a fraud to make their fortune? Or were they simply lost in their own world, finding peace and purpose in the patient, focused act of creation? We will never know. But we can imagine that quiet room and feel a sense of connection to that long-ago person and to the deep human impulse to make a mark, to create something that will outlast us. As we drift further down, let's explore another quiet corner of history, the strange and forgotten profession of the sin eater. This was a folk tradition, practiced in parts of England, Scotland, and Wales, primarily from the 17th to the early 20th century. A sin eater was a person who, through a ritual meal, would take on the sins of a recently deceased person, allowing the soul of the departed to rest in peace. It was a role born of poverty and superstition, a grim but necessary service in the eyes of the community. The sin eater was an outcast, a person who lived on the fringes of society, shunned and feared for the spiritual burden they were believed to carry. Their story is a poignant glimpse into a world of deep faith, social stratification, and the very real fear of what lay beyond death. The ritual of sin-eating was simple and somber. When someone died, the family would send for the sin-eater. A loaf of bread and a bowl of beer or ale would be passed over the body of the deceased, or sometimes placed directly on their chest. The sin eater would then sit, often on a low stool by the door, and consume the bread and beer. As they ate and drank, it was believed that they were absorbing all the unconfessed sins of the departed, freeing the soul from being earthbound. For this service, they would be paid a small fee, typically just a few coins. Once the ritual was complete, they were expected to leave immediately, often without speaking a word. Their presence was a necessary evil, and no one wanted to linger in the company of a person so saturated with the sins of others. The life of a sin eater was one of profound isolation. They were paradoxically essential and reviled. People believed they needed the sin eater's service for the salvation of their loved ones, but they also believed that the sin eater was perpetually damned, their own soul weighted down by the countless transgressions they had consumed. They were often forced to live in remote cottages, away from the main village. Children would be told to avoid them, and adults would cross the street to avoid passing too close. The sin eater was a living embodiment of the community's sins, a scapegoat who carried the spiritual darkness of others so that the village could feel clean. It was a life of deep loneliness, a service performed for a community that offered no comfort, only fear and rejection. The last known sin eater in England is said to have been a man named Richard Munslow, who died in 1906 in Shropshire. His story is a sad one. He was not a destitute outcast, but a respectable farmer who, for reasons that are not entirely clear, revived the practice after the deaths of his own children. Perhaps it was an act of profound grief, a desperate attempt to ensure their peaceful passage to the afterlife. Or perhaps he saw a need in his community and felt a calling to fill it. Whatever his reasons, his revival of this ancient dying custom made him a local curiosity and a figure of some renown. His grave is now a protected historical site, a final, quiet monument to a strange and melancholy tradition that has faded into the mists of history. The tradition of sin eating existed in a gray area between folk belief and official religion. The established church, whether Catholic or Protestant, did not endorse the practice. Official doctrine held that only God, through the clergy, could absolve sin. Sin eating was seen as a pagan superstition, a remnant of an older pre-Christian world. However, for many ordinary people, especially in remote rural areas, the official church was distant, and its rituals sometimes felt insufficient. The sin eater offered something tangible, a direct, physical ritual that gave people a sense of assurance that the spiritual accounts of their loved ones had been settled. It was a grassroots, folk solution to one of life's most profound anxieties, the fate of the soul after death. Let's transition from the spiritual to the purely physical, and consider the fascinating history of a single, monumental structure, the Brooklyn Bridge. When it opened in 1883, it was a miracle of engineering, the longest suspension bridge in the world, a symbol of American ambition, ingenuity, and industrial might. But its construction was a long, arduous, and often tragic saga, a 15-year epic of triumph and despair. The story of the bridge is the story of a family, the Roeblings, who sacrificed their health and their lives to see their grand vision realized. It is a monument not just of steel and stone, but of human endurance, obsession, and the relentless drive to connect and to build. The vision for the Brooklyn Bridge belonged to one man, John A. Roebling, a brilliant German immigrant and a master of suspension bridge design. He had already built several successful bridges, but a bridge connecting the then separate cities of Brooklyn and Manhattan would be his masterpiece. It was a project of unprecedented scale and difficulty. The East River was a busy, treacherous waterway, and the bridge would need to be high enough for the tallest ships to pass underneath. Roebling's design was revolutionary, using a web of steel cables spun from thousands of individual wires, a system he had pioneered. In 1869, his design was approved, and he was appointed chief engineer. The dream was about to become a reality. The story of the bridge takes its first tragic turn almost immediately. Just a few weeks into the project, while taking compass readings at the site of the Brooklyn Tower, John Roebling's foot was crushed by a ferry. Despite the severe injury, Roebling, a believer in unconventional water-based therapies, refused conventional medical treatment. He developed tetanus, and after 3 weeks of agonizing suffering, he died. The grand project had lost its visionary leader before the first stone was even laid. The dream seemed destined to die with him. But John Roebling had a son, Washington Roebling, a talented engineer in his own right, who had served with distinction in the Civil War. The heavy mantle of chief engineer passed from the father to the son. The most dangerous and difficult part of the construction was building the foundations for the two massive stone towers. This required sinking enormous, bottomless wooden boxes called caissons to the riverbed. These caissons were then filled with compressed air to keep the water out, allowing men to dig away the mud and sand down to the solid bedrock. Working in these caisson chambers was hellish. The air was thick and hot, the light was dim, and the men worked in constant fear of fire or a blowout. But the greatest danger was an unknown one: caisson disease, what we now know as the bends. The slow, agonizing, and often fatal effects of nitrogen bubbles forming in the bloodstream from decompressing too quickly were a mystery. Workers would emerge from the caissons crippled, paralyzed, or worse. If you are captured, you're not treated like an honored guest. You are a commodity. You are held for ransom. And if your family is too slow or too poor to pay, you might be left to rot in a damp, lightless cell. Washington Roebling, as a dedicated chief engineer, spent long hours down in the caissons, supervising the work. In 1872, he too fell victim to caisson disease. He was brought out of the chamber paralyzed, in excruciating pain, and permanently disabled. He was confined to his bed, unable to walk, barely able to speak, and suffering from chronic pain for the rest of his life. Like his father, he had been struck down by the bridge. But unlike his father, he did not die. And from his sick bed in his Brooklyn Heights apartment, with a view of the construction site, Washington Roebling refused to give up. He would continue to be the chief engineer, a commander directing his great work from a quiet, pain-filled room. The bridge now needed a new kind of hero, and it found one in Washington's wife, Emily Warren Roebling. With her husband confined to his room, Emily became his eyes, his ears, and his voice. She had no formal training in engineering, but she was intelligent, determined, and a quick study. Every day, she would go to the construction site, carrying her husband's detailed instructions to the assistant engineers. She would observe the progress, ask questions, and then return home to give her husband a full report. Over time, she developed a deep and comprehensive knowledge of the project. She studied mathematics, stress analysis, and cable construction until she was an expert. She became the de facto chief engineer on the ground, a remarkable achievement for a woman in the 19th century. For the next 11 years, this strange and brilliant partnership continued. Washington would watch the bridge rise from his window with the telescope, while Emily managed the immense political, technical, and logistical challenges on a daily basis. She dealt with skeptical politicians, corrupt contractors, and engineering problems. She became the public face of the project, a figure of grace and intelligence who commanded the respect of the all-male world of industrial construction. Without her tireless dedication, her political savvy, and her role as the indispensable link between the mind of the chief engineer and the hands of the builders, the Brooklyn Bridge would likely have never been completed. Finally, on May 24, 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened to the public. It was a day of immense celebration. President Chester A. Arthur attended the ceremony. Schools were closed. It was hailed as the eighth wonder of the world. Washington Roebling, still too ill to attend, watched the fireworks from his window. And in a fitting tribute to her incredible contribution, the first person to ride across the completed bridge in a carriage was Emily Warren Roebling, carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. She had seen the project through from its darkest days to its triumphant conclusion. The bridge stands today as a testament not just to John's vision and Washington's endurance, but to Emily's quiet, brilliant, and revolutionary heroism. Just 1 week after the grand opening, a tragedy occurred that cemented the bridge's place in the public imagination. A woman walking up the steep wooden staircase on the Manhattan side tripped and fell, causing another woman to scream. The scream sparked a panic in the holiday crowd, and a rumor spread that the bridge was collapsing. Thousands of people stampeded, crushing and trampling each other in a desperate attempt to escape. When the chaos subsided, 12 people were dead. This terrible event led to a crisis of public confidence. People were afraid to use the bridge. To prove its stability, the city turned to the master of spectacle, P.T. Barnum. In 1884, he marched 21 of his circus elephants, led by the famous Jumbo, across the bridge. The stunt worked. The public was reassured, and the bridge's reputation for strength and stability was secured. The Brooklyn Bridge is more than just a piece of infrastructure. It is a work of art. Its soaring stone towers with their grand Gothic arches give it the feel of a cathedral. The delicate, spiderweb-like pattern of its cables is a thing of industrial beauty. It has inspired countless painters, poets, and musicians. It is a symbol of New York City itself, strong, resilient, ambitious, and a bridge between the old world and the new. It is a monument to the human spirit's ability to overcome tragedy and adversity, to build something lasting and beautiful that connects us to each other and to our shared history. And as you rest, you can imagine a quiet walk across its wooden promenade, the city spread out before you, a gentle breeze coming off the river, and a deep sense of peace and connection. Let's drift now from the grand scale of public works to the intimate scale of a single, precious commodity. We're going to explore the strange history of ice. Today, we take it for granted. It's in our drinks, it fills our coolers, it's produced by a machine in our freezer. But for most of human history, ice was a rare and luxurious commodity, a symbol of immense wealth and power. The story of how ice went from being a plaything of emperors to a household staple is a story of innovation, ambition, and the creation of a global industry built on the simple, magical properties of frozen water. It's the story of the Ice King, Frederick Tudor, and his quest to sell winter to the world. Before the 19th century, harvesting ice was a small-scale, local affair. In colder climates, wealthy landowners would build insulated ice houses, underground cellars packed with straw or sawdust. In the winter, servants would cut blocks of ice from frozen lakes and ponds and pack them into the ice house. If well insulated, the ice could last through the summer, providing a source for cooling drinks and making frozen desserts for the lord of the manor. It was a luxury reserved for the very rich. For everyone else, a cool drink in summer meant a drink from a cellar or a deep well. The idea of having ice on demand was pure fantasy. This all began to change with a young man from a wealthy Boston family named Frederick Tudor. In 1806, at a family gathering, his brother William made a joke. Why not harvest ice from New England's ponds and sell it to the wealthy planters in the Caribbean who had never seen it? Everyone laughed. But Frederick, a restless and ambitious young man with no interest in a conventional career, took the joke seriously. He became obsessed with the idea. He saw a world of untapped demand. He would teach the hot countries to need cold. It was a vision that was widely seen as insane. People called him the Ice King as a term of mockery. Tudor's first attempt was a financial disaster. In 1806, he chartered a ship, filled it with 130 tons of ice cut from a pond on his family's estate, and set sail for the island of Martinique. He had not thought about how to store the ice once it arrived. He had not created a market for it. The locals were bewildered by the strange, melting cargo. He lost a huge amount of money. For the next decade, Tudor faced failure after failure. He was ridiculed by the Boston business community. He was thrown into debtor's prison 3 times. But he was relentlessly stubborn. He experimented with different insulation materials. Sawdust proved to be the best. He designed specialized tools for cutting the ice into uniform, easily stackable blocks. He built ice houses in his destination ports before the shipments arrived. He was slowly, painfully, building the infrastructure of a new industry. And if you survive all that, your reward is often a small, drafty castle and a plot of land you now have to manage. You've just traded the stress of battle for the stress of crop yields, peasant disputes, and local politics. The turning point for Frederick Tudor came when he realized he wasn't just selling a product, he was selling a new way of life. He had to create the demand. In cities like Havana and New Orleans, he established ice depots where people could buy ice by the pound. He also gave bartenders free ice for a year on the condition that they would sell their drinks for the same price with or without ice. He knew that once people experienced the simple, profound pleasure of an ice-cold drink on a sweltering day, they would be hooked. He was right. The iced drink became a sensation. Tudor had successfully manufactured desire. The Ice King was no longer a joke. He was a visionary. Tudor's business exploded. His New England ice was soon being shipped all over the world. His ships, packed with sawdust-insulated ice, sailed to the American South, to the Caribbean, to South America, and even as far as Calcutta in India. The voyage to India in 1833 was a huge gamble, a 4-month journey through the hottest parts of the ocean. Many believed the entire cargo would melt, but when the ship arrived, more than half the ice was still intact. The British colonists in Calcutta were ecstatic. The ice trade became a truly global enterprise. Tudor's company harvested ice from New England ponds like Fresh Pond in Cambridge and Spy Pond in Arlington on an industrial scale. The winter ice harvest became a major source of seasonal employment for local farmers and laborers. The rise of the ice trade had a profound impact on American life. The icebox, a simple insulated wooden cabinet, became a common piece of kitchen furniture. The iceman, with his horse-drawn cart, became a familiar figure, delivering blocks of ice to households on a daily or weekly basis. This had a revolutionary effect on diet and food safety. For the first time, people could keep perishable foods like milk, butter, and meat fresh for days. It reduced food waste and foodborne illness. The ice trade also fueled the growth of other industries. The brewing industry could now produce lager beer, which requires cool fermentation temperatures year-round. The meatpacking industry in Chicago could ship its products to the East Coast in refrigerated railway cars. The world was being reshaped by frozen water. The natural ice trade, for all its ingenuity, had its limitations. It depended on cold winters. A mild winter in New England could create a shortage and drive up prices. The ice cut from ponds and rivers was also often impure, contaminated with leaves, insects, and bacteria. The solution was artificial ice. In the mid-19th century, inventors like John Gorey in Florida developed early refrigeration and ice-making machines. Initially, these machines were inefficient and expensive and couldn't compete with Tudor's natural ice empire. But as the technology improved, the tide began to turn. By the early 20th century, artificial ice plants were being built in cities across the country, producing clean, pure ice on demand, regardless of the weather. The era of the Ice King was coming to an end. The vast ice houses on the shores of New England's ponds fell into disuse. The teams of men and horses that once swarmed over the frozen lakes in winter were no longer needed. The iceman and his delivery wagon were eventually replaced by the electric refrigerator, which brought the ice factory directly into the home. Frederick Tudor's global empire, built on the seemingly absurd idea of selling frozen water, had been made obsolete by an even more advanced technology. But his legacy remains. He was a pioneer of globalization, a master of marketing, and the man who taught the world the simple, profound joy of being cool. Every time you open your freezer and hear the clatter of an automatic ice maker, you are hearing a distant echo of his strange and brilliant obsession. As our journey tonight nears its end, let's take a moment to reflect on the nature of history itself. We have traveled from the muddy reality of medieval knighthood to the dusty plains of an avian war, from the scandalous journey of a fork to the silent mystery of a book, from the lonely life of a sin-eater to the epic construction of a bridge, and finally, to the cold ambition of the Ice King. These stories seem disparate, but they are connected by a common thread. They are all stories of the human experience. Our ambitions, our follies, our fears, our innovations, and our endless quest for meaning and comfort. History is not just a collection of dates and facts. It is the grand, sprawling, and often very strange story of us. It is a source of endless fascination, a well of quiet wisdom, and a gentle lullaby to help us drift off to sleep. The story of the Sin-Eater is a powerful reminder of how societies create outcasts to manage their anxieties. The Sin-Eater was a necessary functionary in the community's spiritual economy, yet they were pushed to the absolute margins of society. This pattern of creating a scapegoat figure who carries the community's sins, whether literal or metaphorical, is a recurring theme in human history. By projecting their fears and faults onto a single person or group, the community can feel purified without having to do the difficult work of introspection. The Sin-Eater's lonely existence is a testament to this dark and powerful social mechanism, a somber story of a service rendered and a humanity denied. The construction of the Brooklyn Bridge is a powerful allegory for any great long-term project. It began with a brilliant, singular vision. It faced immediate and tragic setbacks. It required a new generation to take up the mantle, adapting and persevering through unforeseen challenges. It depended on the unseen, often uncredited work of a dedicated team. And it was ultimately a collaborative effort. A triumph not of one person but of a family and a community. The story of the Roblings reminds us that great achievements are rarely a straight line. They are messy, difficult, and full of moments of despair. But with vision, endurance, and collaboration, it is possible to build something that stands for generations, a bridge from the past to the future. Frederick Tudor's story is a classic tale of entrepreneurial grit, but it's also a story about changing our perception of the world. Before Tudor, ice was simply a feature of winter, a nuisance, or a local curiosity. Tudor reframed it. He saw it not as a state of matter, but as a product. He took something that was abundant and free in one place and transported it to another where it was rare and valuable. This act of value creation is the heart of so much of our modern economy. Tudor didn't invent ice, he invented the idea of ice as a global commodity. His story is a powerful illustration of how innovation is often not about creating something new, but about seeing the world around us in a new way, and recognizing the hidden potential in the ordinary. Thinking back on the night, his world was one of intense physicality and close-quarters living. The smells, the sounds, the textures of his life were raw and immediate. The stench of the stables, the clang of steel, the feel of rough wool and cold iron. Our modern world is increasingly deodorized, soundproofed, and mediated through smooth glass screens. We have lost a certain kind of sensory richness. The knight's life was brutal and uncomfortable, but it was also undeniably vivid. To contemplate his world is to be reminded of the full, unfiltered spectrum of sensory experience, a rawness that we have traded for comfort and convenience. You are less a hero and more a middle manager with a sword. You are constantly worried about money, loyalty, and the shifting whims of the duke or king you serve. It's a life of anxiety, punctuated by moments of extreme violence. The Great Emu War continues to be a source of fascination because it is a perfect story. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end. It has memorable characters, the flustered Major Meredith, the invulnerable emus. It has conflict, humor, and a surprising resolution. It is a self-contained narrative that requires no complex historical context to understand and enjoy. It is a historical anecdote that functions like a well-told joke or a fable. Its enduring appeal lies in its narrative perfection, its ability to deliver a complete and satisfying story in just a few minutes. It is a little gem of historical absurdity, polished to a shine by a century of retelling. The Fork's journey from sinner to saint of the dinner table is a powerful lesson in the fluidity of cultural norms. What is considered shocking and decadent in one century can become the very definition of propriety in another. The moral outrage directed at the early fork users seems comical to us now, but it was deeply felt at the time. It reminds us that our own strongly held beliefs about what is proper, or civilized, are not timeless truths, they are products of our specific time and place. The fork story encourages a certain humility, a recognition that future generations may look back on some of our own customs with the same bewildered amusement that we feel when we picture a bishop condemning a princess for not eating with her hands. The silence of the Voynich manuscript is perhaps its most powerful feature. In our information-saturated age, we are accustomed to having answers at our fingertips. We can look up any fact, translate any language, solve any puzzle with a few clicks. The Voynich manuscript denies us this satisfaction. It refuses to yield its secrets. It forces us to sit with the unknown, to accept that some things may lie beyond our comprehension. This can be frustrating, but it can also be liberating. The manuscript creates a space for pure wonder, for speculation without the burden of proof. It is a sanctuary of mystery in a world that is increasingly, and sometimes exhaustingly, explained. The story of the Sin Eater, Richard Munslow, dying in the early 20th century, is a poignant example of how long old traditions can linger. We often think of history in neat, clean periods, but the reality is always a messy overlap. While the world was embracing electricity, telephones, and the automobile, this man, in a quiet corner of England, was practicing a ritual that seemed to belong to the Middle Ages. History is not a series of distinct rooms, but a single, rambling house where old furniture and new appliances coexist. The story of the Last Sin Eater is a reminder of the deep, slow currents of folk belief that flow beneath the surface of official history, persisting long after we think they have vanished. The image of Emily Roebling crossing the completed Brooklyn Bridge is a powerful symbol of quiet, determined competence, triumphing over adversity and prejudice. She was not a trained engineer, a politician, or a general. She was a wife and mother who rose to an extraordinary occasion. Her story is a testament to the hidden potential that lies within people, a potential that is often unlocked by crisis. She did not seek the spotlight, but she did not shrink from responsibility. Her deep involvement in one of the greatest engineering feats of her time was a quiet but profound challenge to the strict gender roles of the 19th century. Her ride across the bridge was a victory lap for her husband's vision, but also for her own brilliant unsung work. The ice trade created a new sensory landscape. The clinking of ice in a glass became the sound of refreshment and civilization. The sight of a frosted pitcher on a hot day became a promise of relief. These are sensory experiences that we now take completely for granted, but they were a profound novelty for the people of the 19th century. Frederick Tudor did not just sell ice, he sold a new set of feelings and sensations. He sold the feeling of a cool throat on a humid afternoon, the pleasure of a chilled wine, the relief of a cold compress on a fevered brow. He was a merchant of temperature, a man who found a way to bottle winter and sell it as a feeling. The knight's armor was both his greatest protection and a significant weakness. While it could deflect a sword blow, it was also heavy, cumbersome, and hot. If a knight was unhorsed, he could struggle to get back up, making him vulnerable to foot soldiers with daggers or maces. The armor was designed for mounted combat. On foot, it could be a death trap. This is the paradox of so many technologies. They solve one problem while creating another. The knight's armor was a perfect solution for the problem of a mounted charge, but a poor solution for the problem of a muddy, chaotic melee on the ground. The knight's survival depended on his ability to stay in the specific context for which his technology was designed. The emu's victory was, in a sense, a victory of chaos over order. The military tried to impose a rigid, predictable order on the situation. They had a chain of command, a plan of attack, and a technology designed for systematic destruction. The emus responded with pure, unpredictable chaos. They scattered in all directions. They ran at different speeds. There was no pattern to their flight. The army's orderly system could not cope with the sheer randomness of the emus' behavior. It's a beautiful, if comical, illustration of how systems designed for order can be surprisingly fragile when faced with true, unadulterated chaos. The fork's journey from a two-pronged stabber to a four-pronged scooper is a lovely, small-scale example of design evolution. The initial design was based on the tool's first purpose, spearing meat, but as its use expanded to other foods, vegetables, grains, and saucy dishes, the design had to adapt. The addition of more tines and a curved shape made it more versatile. This change was not a single invention, but a slow, incremental process of improvement, driven by the practical needs of diners. The fork in your kitchen drawer is a silent testament to centuries of trial and error, a humble object that has been slowly perfected by the anonymous contributions of countless users and craftspeople. The Voynich manuscript can be seen as the ultimate unread book. We all have books on our shelves that we own but have never read. They represent a potential for knowledge, a promise of a story we might one day experience. The Voynich manuscript is the archetype of this phenomenon. It is a book that has been owned by many, but read by none. It is pure potential. Its value lies not in the information it contains, but in the information it might contain. It is a symbol of the vastness of the unknown, a beautifully bound volume of pure, tantalizing possibility. As you drift off, you can imagine that book on your own nightstand, its secrets resting peacefully, waiting for a dream to unlock them. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps the channel, and it helps me keep making these little journeys into the past for you. So as you lie there, feeling the clean comfort of your own bed, spare a thought for poor Thomas. The knight in shining armor was mostly a fantasy. The reality was heavy, smelly, boring, and very, very uncomfortable. The Sin Eater's meal, bread and beer, is significant. These are fundamental, almost sacramental elements of European culture. Bread is the, quote, staff of life, a symbol of the body. Beer, or ale, is a product of fermentation, a process of transformation. By consuming these simple, elemental things in the presence of the deceased, the Sin Eater was performing a powerful act of symbolic transference. He was taking the essence of the departed into himself. It was a ritual that was both deeply primal and spiritually complex, a folk sacrament that offered comfort and closure to the grieving community, at the terrible cost of the Sin Eater's own soul. The Brooklyn Bridge's construction coincided with the rise of photography. For the first time, a major construction project could be documented in detail from start to finish. The photographs of the bridge's construction are haunting and beautiful. They show the massive stone towers rising from the river, the dizzying work of spinning the cables high above the water, and the faces of the workers who built it. These images transformed the bridge from a local project into a national spectacle. They allowed people all over the country to follow its progress and to feel a sense of connection to this monumental undertaking. The photographs helped to build the legend of the bridge, ensuring that its story would be preserved not just in words but in stunning, unassailable images. Frederick Tudor's obsession with ice was, in a way, an obsession with controlling time. The natural cycle of the seasons dictates that summer is hot and winter is cold. Ice is a fleeting product of winter. By harvesting it, storing it, and shipping it, Tudor was essentially capturing a piece of winter and making it available in the middle of summer. He was breaking the tyranny of the seasonal clock. This desire to overcome the limitations of nature and time is a driving force of human innovation. From agriculture, which allows us to store the harvest of one season for another, to the internet, which allows us to communicate instantly across time zones, we are constantly seeking ways to master time. The ice trade was an early and particularly elegant example of this fundamental human impulse. Let's consider the medieval knight's relationship with pain. In a world without anesthetics or effective painkillers, pain was a constant and unavoidable part of life. From the minor aches of training and riding to the severe trauma of battle wounds, a knight lived with a level of physical suffering that is hard for us to imagine. The chivalric ideal of stoicism was not just a moral virtue, it was a practical necessity. The ability to endure pain without complaint was a crucial survival skill. This constant exposure to pain must have shaped their entire worldview, perhaps leading to a certain fatalism, or a deeper appreciation for the simple, fleeting moments of comfort and peace. The legend of the emus having a leader who directed them in battle is a wonderful example of anthropomorphism. The soldiers, trained to see conflict in terms of command and strategy, projected their own military worldview onto the birds. They saw what they expected to see, an organized enemy. The reality was likely just that in any flock of animals, some individuals are naturally more alert or bolder than others. But the story of the cunning emu general was more compelling. It helped the soldiers to make sense of their failure. They weren't defeated by a dumb animal, they were outsmarted by a brilliant tactician. The myth served a psychological purpose, preserving the soldiers' dignity in the face of a deeply embarrassing defeat. The fork's journey highlights how quickly we forget the past. For most of us, a world without forks is almost unimaginable. We assume that this basic tool has always been there. The idea that it was once controversial, a symbol of sin and decadence, seems absurd. This is a form of historical amnesia. We live so completely in our own time that we lose touch with the very different realities of the past. The story of the fork is a gentle corrective to this tendency. It reminds us that our normal is not a permanent state of affairs. It is a specific, contingent arrangement that was forged in the fires of controversy, and it will continue to change in ways we cannot yet imagine. The Voynich manuscript is the ultimate unsolved case file. It has been examined by a long line of detectives, historians, linguists, cryptographers, and computer scientists. Each has applied their own tools and theories. Each has found tantalizing clues. But the case remains open. This lack of resolution is part of its endless appeal. Unlike a mystery novel, where the solution is revealed in the final chapter, the Voynich manuscript offers no such closure. It is a story without an ending. And so it invites us to become the detectives, to sift through the evidence, to form our own theories, and to participate in the ongoing collective investigation of this beautiful 600-year-old crime against comprehension. The social isolation of the Sin Eater is a powerful metaphor for the way we often treat those who do society's dirty work. From the garbage collector to the funeral director, there are many professions that deal with the aspects of life we would rather not think about. While we depend on their services, these roles can carry a certain social stigma. The Sin Eater is the most extreme and literal example of this. He took on the spiritual dirt of the community, and for this, he was made unclean himself. His story is a somber reflection on the human tendency to create distance between ourselves and the uncomfortable realities of life and death, often at the expense of those who handle that reality for us. The Brooklyn Bridge is a symphony of tension and compression. The massive stone towers are in a state of pure compression, their weight bearing down on the solid bedrock below. The steel cables are in a state of pure tension, stretched taut as they hold up the roadway. This perfect balance of opposing forces is what gives the bridge its strength and its grace. It is a physical manifestation of harmony achieved through opposition. This engineering principle can also be seen as a metaphor for the story of its creation, the compression of grief and despair balanced by the tension of relentless ambition and hope. The bridge is a beautiful, stable structure born from a deeply unstable and dramatic history. The global reach of the ice trade was a preview of our modern, interconnected world. The idea that a block of ice cut from a pond in Massachusetts could be used to cool a drink in India was revolutionary. It required a complex logistical network of ships, ice houses, and local distributors. It was one of the first truly global supply chains for a perishable consumer product. Frederick Tudor's enterprise demonstrated that with enough ingenuity and determination, the geographical limitations of climate could be overcome. His ships, sailing the world with their strange cold cargo, were weaving a new web of global commerce, a web that has grown ever more complex and now touches every aspect of our daily lives. And now, let's drift from the mud of medieval Europe to the dusty plains of 1930s Australia, and to a conflict so bizarre it sounds like a joke. This is the story of the Great Emu War, a cautionary tale about what happens when humanity wildly overestimates its own competence in the face of nature. After World War I, the Australian government settled thousands of veterans in Western Australia, encouraging them to become wheat farmers. It was a tough life on marginal land, a promise of a new start that was already on shaky ground. And then, the emus came. Not just a few, an army. An estimated 20,000 of them, migrating inland after their breeding season, discovered that this newly cultivated farmland was an all-you-can-eat buffet. They were a force of nature, trampling fences and devouring crops with terrifying efficiency. The farmers, many of them former soldiers, were desperate. They appealed to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, and in a decision that would echo through the halls of military absurdity forever, he agreed to send in the troops. The code of chivalry, with its emphasis on protecting the weak and defending the innocent, was a beautiful ideal. But it was an ideal that was often honored in the breach. The same knight, who might be a paragon of courtesy at a tournament, could be a brutal commander during a siege, ordering the slaughter of civilians. This gap between the ideal and the reality is a constant theme in human history. We create noble codes and high-minded laws, but our actions often fall short. The story of the knight is not a story of heroes and villains, but of flawed human beings struggling, and often failing, to live up to the lofty ideals they set for themselves. The legacy of the Great Emu War is, in a word, joy. It is a story that, in its retelling, seems to bring a universal sense of delight and amusement. It's a rare historical event that is almost entirely free of malice or tragedy. No humans were harmed. The emu population was fine. The only casualty was the dignity of the Australian military. And that, in the grand scheme of things, is a small price to pay for a story that has brought laughter to so many people for so many years. It is a purely joyful piece of history, a reminder that the past is not always a story of darkness and conflict. Sometimes, it is a story of 3 men, a truck, and a flock of very, very fast birds. The fork's victory was, in the end, a victory for a certain idea of civilization. The use of the fork came to be seen as a marker of a civilized person, separating them from the barbaric habits of the past. This idea of a linear progression from barbarism to civilization is a powerful but also problematic narrative. It often carries with it a sense of cultural superiority. The story of the fork is a small part of this larger story. It is a tale of how one culture's specific customs and technologies came to be seen as a universal standard of progress. But as the continued use of chopsticks and hands in other vibrant food cultures shows, there is more than one way to be civilized at the dinner table. The Voynich manuscript is a powerful argument for the preservation of the unknown. In our rush to solve, to categorize, and to understand, we can sometimes lose our sense of wonder. The manuscript resists this. It demands that we appreciate it on its own terms. As a beautiful and mysterious object, its value lies not in any secret it might hold, but in its ability to inspire curiosity and humility. It teaches us that there is a profound beauty in a question that cannot be answered, a story that cannot be read. It is a monument to the enduring power of mystery in a world that is obsessed with solutions. The ritual of sin-eating, by placing the sins of the deceased onto a piece of bread, made sin a tangible thing. It transformed an abstract spiritual concept into something that could be held, passed, and consumed. This desire to make the abstract concrete is a fundamental human impulse. We create symbols, rituals, and objects to help us grasp concepts that are too large or too ethereal to understand on their own. The sin-eater's humble meal was a powerful piece of folk theology, a way of dealing with the immense and terrifying idea of sin by reducing it to the scale of a simple loaf of bread and a bowl of beer. The Brooklyn Bridge today is so iconic, so much a part of the New York landscape, that it feels as if it has always been there. It is hard to imagine the world before it, when Brooklyn and Manhattan were two separate cities, connected only by a fleet of unreliable ferries. The bridge transformed the region, fueling the growth of Brooklyn and paving the way for the creation of Greater New York City in 1898. It is a powerful example of how a single piece of infrastructure can fundamentally reshape the social and economic geography of a place. It did not just connect two pieces of land, it created a new kind of city. Frederick Tudor's story is a lesson in the power of persistence. He faced years of failure, ridicule, and financial ruin. A more sensible person would have given up. But Tudor had a singular, obsessive vision, and he refused to let it go. His story is a testament to the fact that great innovations are often born not from a single flash of genius, but from a long, grueling process of trial, error, and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He was willing to fail, and to fail publicly again and again in the service of his idea. It is this capacity for resilience in the face of failure that often separates the visionary from the dreamer. The medieval knight was a specialist in a world that was becoming increasingly specialized. He was a master of a specific kind of warfare, heavy cavalry combat. But as the nature of war changed, his specialty became less relevant. The rise of professional infantry, archers, and gunpowder armies required new skills and new kinds of soldiers. The knight's decline is a story of specialization leading to obsolescence. It's a pattern that has been repeated throughout history, as new technologies and new social structures render old professions and old ways of life obsolete. The knight was a perfect tool for a specific job, but eventually the job itself changed. The story of the Emu War is a profoundly peaceful story to drift off to. There is no real violence, no malice, no tragedy. It is a story of pure, harmless incompetence. The stakes were low, and the outcome was comical. It is a gentle, soothing narrative that allows the mind to relax. It is a story where the good guys, the emus in this telling, win, and the bad guys, the bumbling military, are not punished, but simply retreat in a state of mild embarrassment. It is a conflict without victims, a war without tears. And that makes it a perfect, gentle lullaby from the strange and wonderful annals of history. The fork, in its final triumphant form, is an object of quiet elegance and perfect utility. It is one of the few tools that has remained largely unchanged for over a century. Its design has been so thoroughly refined that it is difficult to improve upon. It is a small, everyday example of peak design. In a world of constant upgrades and planned obsolescence, the fork is a comforting constant. It is a reliable, familiar presence on our tables. Its long, strange, and controversial journey has ended in a state of quiet, unassuming perfection. And there is a deep, relaxing satisfaction in that. The military operation was, on paper, a small but professional affair. It was placed under the command of Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. He was given 2 soldiers, Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran, and, most importantly, 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. A newsreel cameraman from Fox Movietone was also sent along to capture the expected triumph for the nation. The plan seemed simple, almost laughably so. They would use machine guns, the pinnacle of modern warfare that had dominated the battlefields of Europe, against a bunch of large, flightless birds. What could possibly go wrong? It was seen as a win-win. The farmers would be saved, the military would get some target practice, and the public would get to see a decisive victory over a national pest. The confidence was palpable. Major Meredith and his men rolled into the Campion district, ready to teach these feathered marauders a lesson in military might. They were about to learn that the emus had not read the script. As you lie on the edge of sleep, imagine holding the Voynich manuscript. Feel the cool, smooth texture of the vellum pages. See the elegant, flowing script that seems to dance across the page. Look at the strange, beautiful drawings of impossible flowers and serene bathing figures. Do not try to understand it. Do not try to solve it. Just experience it. Let its mystery wash over you like a gentle wave. Let its silence be a source of peace. It is a book that asks for nothing but your quiet wonder. And in that wonder, there is a profound and deep rest. The tradition of the Sin Eater, though it has vanished, speaks to a timeless human need for closure and the settling of accounts. We all carry regrets, the memory of things we have done or left undone. The Sin Eater's ritual was a way of externalizing and resolving the spiritual debts of the deceased, bringing peace to both the departed and the living. As you drift off, you can let go of your own accounts from the day. There is no need for a Sin Eater. The night itself is a gentle absolution. It is a chance to release the burdens of the day, to let them be consumed by the quiet darkness, and to prepare for the clean slate of a new morning. Picture yourself standing on the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn. The city is still quiet. A few early morning joggers pass by. The sky begins to lighten, turning from deep indigo to soft pink and orange. The cables of the bridge form a beautiful, intricate web against the morning sky. You can feel the gentle vibration of the structure as the first subway train of the day rumbles beneath your feet. It is a moment of perfect peace and profound connection to the city, to the past, and to the enduring power of human creation. Let this feeling of serene, stable connection be your anchor as you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep. The story of the ice trade is a story of transformation. A solid becomes a liquid. A nuisance becomes a luxury. A local product becomes a global commodity. A joke becomes a fortune. This theme of transformation is a soothing one. It reminds us that things are not always as they seem, and that even the most unlikely ideas can have a profound impact. It is a story of the world changing in surprising and wonderful ways. As you sleep, your own mind undergoes a transformation, from the focused logic of the waking world to the free-flowing creativity of the dream world. Embrace this gentle, nightly transformation, this melting of the day's concerns, into the cool, quiet waters of sleep. The knight in his armor was a man encased. He was protected from the world, but also separated from it. His vision was limited, his hearing was muffled, his sense of touch was dulled by layers of padding and steel. As you lie in your bed, you are the opposite of the knight. You are unarmored. You are open to the softness of your blankets, the quiet sounds of the night, the gentle darkness of the room. You are safe without being encased. Let go of the armor you may have worn throughout the day, the armor of stress, of responsibility, of alertness. Allow yourself to be soft, to be open, and to be at peace. There are no battles to be fought tonight. There is only rest. And so, our journey through the quiet corridors of the past comes to a gentle close. We have seen that history is not a dry collection of facts, but a rich tapestry of human stories. Stories of failure and triumph, of mystery and innovation, of deep sorrow and absurd joy. These stories are a gift from the past. They offer us perspective, comfort, and a sense of connection to the long, strange, and beautiful river of human experience. As you finally let go and drift away, know that you are a part of this river. Your own small story is woven into this grand tapestry. And tonight, it is a story of quiet, of comfort, and of deep, well-deserved rest. Sleep well. The first engagement took place on the 2nd of November, 1932. The soldiers spotted a flock of about 50 emus. The local settlers, eager to help, attempted to herd the birds into an ambush, a perfect kill zone for the Lewis gun. The birds, however, proved to be surprisingly uncooperative. Instead of clustering together into a convenient target, they scattered in all directions, running with incredible speed and chaotic unpredictability. The gunner opened fire, but the range was too great and the targets too erratic. A second attempt later in the day yielded a small number of kills, but it was a Pyrrhic victory at best. The vast majority of the flock simply melted away into the bush. Major Meredith noted in his report, with a hint of begrudging respect, that the emus seemed to have an uncanny ability to face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. He observed that each flock appeared to have a leader, a tall, black-plumed bird that would keep watch while its comrades engaged in their destructive work, giving a warning call that sent the group scattering long before they were in effective range. The emus, it turned out, were tactical geniuses. A few days later, the military command decided to move the operation further south, where the birds were reportedly tamer and more concentrated. They set up another ambush near a local dam, where over 1,000 emus had been spotted. This time, they would be ready. They lay in wait, the Lewis gun perfectly positioned for maximum effect. As the emus approached, the gunner held his fire until they were at point-blank range. The moment the gun roared to life, however, it jammed after firing just a dozen rounds. Before the soldiers could clear the stoppage, the entire flock had vanished over the horizon, leaving behind only the echo of the failed volley and the profound frustration of the men. The newsreel cameraman, who had been hoping for dramatic footage of feathered carnage, captured nothing but a few distant, fleeing birds. The war was not going well. The emus were proving to be a frustratingly resilient and intelligent foe, seemingly able to anticipate every move the soldiers made. Major Meredith's frustration grew with each failed attempt. His official reports began to sound less like a military commander and more like a naturalist baffled by his subject. He famously commented, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." He noted their bizarrely effective defensive strategy. Upon being fired at, the flock would break up into innumerable small units, making them an impossible target for organized fire. The 10,000 rounds of ammunition they had brought seemed wildly insufficient to deal with this decentralized guerrilla-style warfare. The press began to catch on to the story, and the tone shifted from one of patriotic support to one of open mockery. The image of the mighty Australian army being outsmarted by a population of birds was just too good to pass up. The emus were becoming folk heroes. By the 8th of November, just 6 days after the first engagement, the operation was facing intense scrutiny. After the first 500 rounds of ammunition had been fired, the official kill count was a paltry 50 emus. Some reports even claimed it was as low as 20. One politician in the Australian House of Representatives wryly asked if a medal was to be awarded for the war. His colleague responded that it should go to the emus, who had won every round so far. The public perception had turned completely. The emu war became a national joke, a symbol of governmental folly. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, who had authorized the mission, was facing ridicule. The cost, the futility, and the sheer absurdity of the situation led to an inevitable conclusion. The military ordered a withdrawal. The Great Emu War was over, and the emus had, by all accounts, won a decisive victory. Major Meredith and his men packed up their Lewis guns and returned from the field, defeated. The farmers were, of course, still plagued by the birds and were not happy about the withdrawal. They again asked for military support later that month. This time, the government, perhaps having learned a lesson in humility, refused. Instead, a bounty system was instituted, which proved to be far more effective over the long run. In a 6-month period in 1934, over 57,000 bounties were claimed. The Great Emu War remains a strange footnote in military history, a perfect example of the limits of conventional thinking when faced with an unconventional problem. It's a story of hubris, of underestimating your opponent, and of the surprising resilience of nature. It serves as a gentle, humorous reminder that sometimes The most sophisticated solutions are no match for a simple, determined, and very, very fast-running bird. Now, let's leave the dusty battlefields of Australia and travel to a much more intimate setting. The dinner table. We're going to explore the surprisingly scandalous and controversial history of an object you probably use today without a second thought. The fork. It seems so simple, so essential, yet for centuries, this humble utensil was seen as a symbol of sin, decadence, and an affront to God himself. To understand why, we have to imagine a world without it. For most of human history, eating was a hands-on affair. People used their fingers, a personal knife to cut meat, and a spoon for liquids. It was a communal, often messy, but perfectly acceptable way to eat. The idea of introducing a new, specialized tool just for conveying solid food to your mouth seemed utterly unnecessary, and to some, deeply suspicious. The earliest ancestors of the fork weren't for eating at all. Large, two-pronged forks existed in ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, but they were used as cooking and carving implements, for lifting hot meat from a cauldron or holding a roast steady while it was being sliced. They were kitchen tools, closer to a pair of tongs than to what we have in our cutlery drawer. The idea of putting one of these little pitchfork-like objects into one's mouth was simply not on the menu. The personal, intimate act of eating was done with the tools God gave you, your hands. This long-standing tradition meant that the introduction of a personal eating fork would be met not with enthusiasm, but with deep-seated cultural resistance. It was a solution to a problem that nobody believed they had. And as always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight. It's wonderful to imagine this strange little history club scattered all across the quiet corners of the world, all settling in together. The story of the fork as a personal eating utensil really begins in the Byzantine Empire, the sophisticated eastern remnant of the Roman world. It was here, in the opulent courts of Constantinople, that small, elegant forks became a tool of the elite. The pivotal moment for its journey west came in the 11th century, specifically the year 1004. A Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropolina traveled to Venice to marry the son of the Doge. She brought with her a trousseau befitting her station, which included a case of small, two-pronged golden forks. At her wedding feast, she shocked the Venetian court by refusing to eat with her hands, instead using her strange golden implements to delicately lift food to her mouth. The Venetians were not impressed. They were scandalized. The reaction was swift and severe, particularly from the clergy. The influential churchman, and later saint, Peter Damian, condemned the princess's fork usage as a sign of sinful vanity and excessive softness. He wrote with venom about her luxurious habits, seeing the fork as the height of decadence. His argument was theological. God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers. Therefore, it is an insult to him to substitute artificial metal forks for them when eating. When the princess died a few years later from the plague, Damian declared it was divine punishment for her pride and her unnatural forked arrogance. This narrative stuck. For centuries, the fork was branded as an instrument of the devil, a diabolical tool that signaled a departure from God-fearing simplicity. Despite the clerical outrage, the fork began a slow, almost glacial process of adoption in Italy. Venice, as a major trading hub with the East, was the entry point. Over the next few centuries, the fork remained a curiosity, an object associated with courtesans and the extremely wealthy who wanted to show off their refinement and their worldly connections. By the time of the Renaissance, it had become a status symbol among the powerful merchant families of Florence and other city-states. Having a fork at your table was a way of signaling that you were sophisticated, modern, and perhaps a little bit more civilized than your neighbors who were still grabbing their pasta with their hands. But even here, its use was far from universal. It was an affectation, a piece of performance art at the dinner table, and it was still viewed with suspicion by many. The fork's journey into the rest of Europe was even more fraught. It was Catherine de' Medici who was famously credited with introducing the fork to France when she married King Henry II in 1533. She brought her Italian chefs, her artichokes, her ice cream, and her forks to the French court. The French, much like the Venetians centuries before, were largely unimpressed. The men of the court viewed it as an effeminate and ridiculously fussy tool. They mocked those who used it, seeing it as a sign of weakness. Why use a tiny spear when a man could use his knife and his fingers? The fork struggled to gain a foothold, remaining a plaything of a few avant-garde aristocrats for another 100 years or so. It took until the reign of Louis XIV in the late 17th century for the fork to begin to become more accepted in polite French society, and even then, it was a slow burn. The English were perhaps the most resistant of all. They viewed the fork as a silly, pretentious Italian affectation. In 1611, an English traveler named Thomas Coriat published a book about his journeys through Europe, in which he described the Italian custom of using forks. He was so taken with the habit that he tried to introduce it back home in England. He was mercilessly ridiculed for his efforts. He was given nicknames like Furcifer, a Latin pun meaning fork bearer, but also rascal or gallows bird. The general consensus was that forks were for soft, foppish continentals, not for sturdy, sensible Englishmen. For another 2 centuries, the fork remained a rarity in Britain, a strange object seen only in the homes of the most flamboyant or well-traveled members of the upper class. The common person would have likely never even seen one. Even in the New World, the fork was a latecomer. The early American colonists, being predominantly of British stock, brought their dining habits with them. They ate with knives, spoons, and their hands. The dominant technique for much of American history was the cut and switch. You would cut your meat with the knife in your right hand, then lay the knife down, pick up the spoon in your right hand, and use it to scoop up the meat and other food. The fork, when it did begin to appear in the 18th and early 19th centuries, was often a simple 2-pronged affair, used mostly for steadying meat while cutting, not for conveying it to the mouth. The 4-tined, curved fork that we know today didn't become a standard part of an American place setting until the Victorian era, in the latter half of the 19th century. So what finally allowed the fork to conquer the world? It was a combination of factors. The rise of a new middle class in the 19th century created a demand for symbols of refinement and etiquette. Complex new rules for dining became a way to distinguish oneself, and a full set of elaborate silverware was a key part of that performance. Concerns about hygiene also played a role, as the Victorian era brought a new awareness of germs. And finally, industrial manufacturing made forks cheap and accessible to everyone. The once diabolical tool of a Byzantine princess became a mass-produced staple. It's a quiet reminder that the things we consider normal and essential often have long, strange, and deeply contentious histories. Every time you pick up a fork, you're holding an object that was once considered the very height of sin and foolishness. And now, for our final story of the night, we turn from an object whose history is known to one whose meaning is a complete and utter mystery. We are venturing into the world of cryptography, linguistics, and art history to look at one of the most baffling artifacts in existence, the Voynich manuscript. It's a book that has defied every attempt at comprehension, a puzzle box that has stumped the world's greatest minds for over a century. It's a perfect subject to drift off to, a mystery so deep and so strange that it invites us to simply let go and float in its enigma. The manuscript itself is a relatively small, unassuming codex, a handwritten book from the early 15th century, carbon dated to between 1404 and 1438. It's named after Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish-American rare book dealer who purchased it from a Jesuit college in Italy in 1912. And from the moment he opened it, the mystery began. The first and most profound mystery of the Voynich manuscript is its text. The entire book, over 240 pages, is written in a unique, elegant, and completely unknown script. The alphabet, or Voynichese as it's been dubbed, consists of about 20 to 30 distinct characters, none of which correspond to any known language system. It flows smoothly, as if written by someone who was completely fluent in it. Statistical analysis shows that it follows certain patterns found in real languages, like word frequency and the arrangement of letters, which suggests it isn't just random gibberish. Yet, to this day, not a single word has been deciphered. It is a locked room of a text. We can see inside, we can admire the shape of the furniture, but the door is sealed, and the key has been lost to time, if it ever existed at all. Complementing the inscrutable text are the illustrations, which are, if anything, even stranger. They are what give the manuscript its character and its main thematic sections. The first and largest section is the herbal section. Each page features a drawing of a plant, accompanied by that flowing, unreadable text. The problem is that the vast majority of these plants are unidentifiable. They don't match any known species on Earth. Some look like composites, with the roots of one plant, the leaves of another, and the flower of a third. They are fantastical, alien botanicals, drawn with a strange combination of careful detail and whimsical imagination. Are they real, extinct plants? Are they symbolic representations? Or are they simply the product of a wonderfully bizarre imagination? No one knows. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and get into that perfect position. Let go of the day. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, starting with a reality check for the ages. The next section is often called the astronomical or astrological section. It contains circular diagrams, charts of stars and suns and moons, many with stylized faces. There are drawings that resemble zodiacal signs, a ram for Aries, a bull for Taurus, but they are often surrounded by strange embellishments and rings of tiny, naked figures. The cosmology depicted is unique and doesn't seem to align perfectly with any known European or Eastern system of the time. It's as if someone was documenting the heavens of another world, or perhaps an internal, symbolic universe. The charts are intricate and seemingly purposeful, but their purpose, their meaning, remains completely hidden from us, locked behind the veil of the unknown script. Perhaps the most famous and baffling part of the manuscript is the balneological section. The name comes from the Latin for related to bathing. These pages are filled with elaborate, interconnected drawings of pipes, tubes, and pools through which a strange green or blue liquid seems to flow. And within these pools and tubes are dozens and dozens of small, naked female figures. They are not depicted in a lurid or sexual way. They seem almost clinical, or perhaps symbolic. They bathe. They hold strange objects. They stand in bizarre contraptions. Some of the pools look like organs of the body. What on earth is this section depicting? A guide to midwifery? An alchemical allegory? A forgotten health spa manual? The theories are endless, and the images themselves are a kind of beautiful, inscrutable dream. The final sections of the book are just as strange. There's a pharmaceutical section, which shows disembodied plant parts, roots, leaves, seed pods, next to what look like apothecary jars, all meticulously labeled in the same unreadable script. It looks for all the world like a recipe book or a pharmacopoeia, but for ingredients that don't exist. And finally, there's a section of solid text, with star-like markers in the margins, as if marking out individual entries or paragraphs. It gives the impression of a serious, organized work of scholarship. But what it is a work of is the central, tantalizing question that has haunted researchers for a century. The entire book feels like a glimpse into a parallel reality, one that is logical and consistent on its own terms, but completely alien to ours. So what could it be? The theories are as numerous and as strange as the illustrations themselves. The first and most hopeful theory is that it's a real, lost natural language, or perhaps a known language written in a substitute cipher, a simple code where each Voynich character stands for a letter in, say, Latin or German. The problem is that every single attempt to apply a simple cipher has failed. The word structures in Voynichese don't behave like any known European language when decoded this way. This has led to the theory that it might be a more complex, polyalphabetic cipher, something far ahead of its time. But even the most brilliant codebreakers have been unable to crack it. Famed cryptologists who broke enemy codes in World War I and II, like William and Elizabeth Friedman, spent decades on the manuscript and came away with nothing but frustration. Another popular theory is that the entire thing is an elaborate and brilliant hoax. Perhaps it was created in the late 16th century by a clever forger to sell to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who was a known collector of curiosities and occult objects. Under this theory, the text is meaningless gibberish, designed to look like a real language to fool a wealthy patron. The problem with the hoax theory is the sheer amount of effort involved. The text is over 240 pages long and shows remarkable consistency. The statistical properties that mimic real language are hard to fake, especially before the age of computers. Why would someone go to such incredible lengths to create a hoax of this complexity? And carbon dating places the vellum and ink firmly in the early 15th century, long before the time of Rudolph II, which complicates the forger narrative significantly, though not impossibly. A more recent and intriguing set of theories falls under the umbrella of outsider art. Perhaps the manuscript wasn't meant to be a code or a repository of knowledge for others at all. Perhaps it was the intensely personal, private work of a single, isolated individual. It could be an example of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, meticulously written down. Or it could be the detailed record of a personal, mystical vision, a private cosmology that made perfect sense to its creator but was never intended for an outside audience. In this view, trying to decipher it is missing the point. It's not a message to be read, but a piece of art to be experienced, the product of a unique and unknowable mind. It's the ultimate diary, written in a language of one. The history of the manuscript's ownership is almost as mysterious as its contents. After its creation in the 15th century, it disappears for about 200 years. It surfaces in Prague in the early 17th century, in the hands of Emperor Rudolf II's circle. From there it passes through the hands of various alchemists and scholars before ending up in the possession of the Jesuits in Rome. It was stored, likely unread and forgotten, in their library for centuries until Wilfrid Voynich rediscovered it in 1912. Each person who owned it seemed to be captivated by its mystery, but none could unlock it. It's a silent witness to centuries of changing scientific and esoteric thought, a constant, unsolved puzzle passed down through the ages. In the modern era, the Voynich manuscript has become the Mount Everest for cryptologists, linguists, and computer scientists. With the advent of artificial intelligence, researchers have fed the text into powerful machine learning algorithms, hoping that a computer could spot patterns that the human eye has missed. There have been several flashes of excitement, with various AI programs suggesting it might be a form of Hebrew, or a lost Romance dialect, or an anagrammed code. But each of these claims has, upon further review, fallen apart. The manuscript guards its secrets as fiercely from silicon processors as it does from human minds. Its resistance to our most advanced tools only deepens its allure. In the end, the true power of the Voynich manuscript may lie in its very insolvability. It is a perfect mirror. We project our own desires onto it. The cryptographer sees a brilliant code. The linguist sees a lost language. The art historian sees a symbolic masterpiece. The skeptic sees a clever fraud. It is a Rorschach test made of vellum and ink. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, to accept that there are some puzzles that may never be solved. And there is a strange comfort in that. In a world where every piece of information is just a click away, the Voynich manuscript remains stubbornly, beautifully, and profoundly silent. And so, as you drift off to sleep, let that silence be a gentle, soothing blanket. Let the mystery be a quiet space for your mind to rest, a beautiful, unreadable book on the nightstand of your dreams. Let's return to our friend, the medieval knight. We've established that his life was uncomfortable, but let's consider the financial aspect. Knighthood was, at its core, a business. The armor, the warhorse, the weapons, the squire. This was not cheap. It was like owning a very aggressive, very high-maintenance sports car today. A knight had to have land and income from that land to support his career. This meant he was also a landlord, constantly worried about harvests, rents, and the local economy. A bad year for wheat could be as devastating as a lost skirmish. The pressure to maintain the expensive trappings of his station was immense. Many knights lived on the edge of bankruptcy, their shiny armor hiding a deep well of financial anxiety. It was a life of immense economic pressure, a far cry from the carefree adventurer of legend. Forget the storybooks. Forget the gallant heroes on white steeds. You are not Sir Lancelot. You are a 14-year-old boy named Thomas, and your life is mostly about avoiding the stable master's switch and trying not to spill wine on your lord's tunic. The social life of a knight was also a minefield. The code of chivalry was a complex and often contradictory set of ideals. You were supposed to be pious and merciful, but also a ruthless warrior. You were supposed to be courteous and courtly, especially to ladies, but you were also part of a brutal military system. Navigating these expectations was a constant performance. A slip of the tongue at a feast, a breach of etiquette, or backing the wrong lord in a political dispute could have dire consequences. It was a world of rigid hierarchies and social paranoia. Your reputation, or honor, was your most valuable asset, and it was a fragile thing, easily shattered. This constant need to project an image of perfect chivalrous strength must have been utterly exhausting. Thinking again about the Great Emu War, it's fascinating to consider the emu's perspective, if we can call it that. They weren't fighting a war, they were surviving. They were following ancient migratory patterns, and they stumbled upon an unexpected and wonderful food source. Their tactics weren't a conscious military strategy. They were the evolved survival instincts of a prey animal. When threatened, they scatter. They run fast. They are unpredictable. The Australian army tried to fight a conventional war against an unconventional, non-sentient force. They brought rules, order, and technology to a problem that was fundamentally about chaos and biology. The emus didn't win by being smart. They won by being emus. It's a humbling lesson in seeing a problem for what it is, not what you want it to be. The media portrayal of the Emu War is a key part of its legend. The newsreel cameraman sent to capture a glorious victory ended up documenting a farce. The newspaper articles, dripping with sarcasm, cemented the narrative. They created characters, the beleaguered Major Meredith and his invincible feathered foes. It became a story, a piece of national folklore. This highlights how our understanding of history is so often shaped by the narrative that gets told. Without the witty journalists and the public's appetite for a story about government incompetence, the Emu War might have just been a forgotten footnote in a military logistics report. Instead, it became a timeless comedy, a testament to the power of a good story to define an event. Let's consider the fork again, from a different angle: hygiene. Before the fork, people washed their hands before a meal, but the act of eating was still a very direct experience. Sharing bowls and tearing meat with your hands was the norm. The fork introduced a barrier, a layer of technology between the person and their food. Proponents of the fork, like Thomas Coriat, argued it was a cleaner, more refined way to eat. You didn't have to get your hands greasy. In an age before widespread understanding of germs, this was more about aesthetics than health. But it planted a seed. The idea that some ways of eating were cleaner than others began to take hold. The fork's journey is part of a larger story about our changing relationship with food, our bodies, and the concept of cleanliness itself. The evolution of the fork's design is also a quiet story of function and fashion. The early two-pronged forks were good for stabbing a piece of meat, but not much else. You couldn't really eat peas with one. The addition of a third and then a fourth tine made it more versatile, more like a scoop. The gentle curve that most modern forks have was another innovation, making it easier to lift food to the mouth. These changes happened slowly, over centuries, driven by the practical needs of diners and the stylistic trends of silverware designers. It's a small-scale example of technological evolution. The fork we use today is the result of hundreds of years of trial and error. A humble masterpiece of ergonomic design that we take completely for granted. Returning to the Voynich manuscript, let's linger on the illustrations of the bathing women. There is a dreamlike quality to them. They are not realistic anatomical drawings. Their bellies are often swollen, and their expressions are placid and serene. They seem to exist in a closed, self-contained world of flowing green liquid and strange organic plumbing. Some have suggested it might be a uniquely female-centric text, perhaps a book of lore or medicine created by and for women, a group whose knowledge was often excluded from official scholarly records. Could it be a midwife's guide, using symbolic imagery to explain the processes of the female body? It's a compelling idea that this unreadable book might be a lost voice from a silent half of history, speaking a language we can no longer understand. The very materials of the Voynich manuscript tell a story. The pages are made of vellum, which is prepared animal skin. It was a durable but expensive material. The creation of a 240-page vellum codex was a major undertaking, requiring significant resources. The ink has been analyzed and found to be a typical iron gall ink used in the period. The colored paints for the illustrations are made from common minerals. This tells us that whoever created it was serious. This was not a quick, cheap doodle. It was a significant investment of time, effort, and money. This physical evidence argues against the idea of it being a casual joke. Whatever its purpose, be it code, art, or science, it was a project of immense dedication. The object itself demands to be taken seriously, even if its contents remain utterly playful in their mystery. The concept of chivalry, which so defined the knight, was largely a literary invention. It was popularized by epic poems and romances, like the stories of King Arthur and his knights. These tales were entertainment for the nobility. They created an idealized version of the warrior class that probably had very little to do with reality. Real knights were likely more interested in land grants and political power than in rescuing damsels or searching for the Holy Grail. But the myth was powerful. It gave a violent and often brutal profession a veneer of moral purpose. Knights themselves may have even tried to live up to the fantasy, creating a strange feedback loop where literature influenced life. The suck of being a knight was perhaps the huge gap between this beautiful, romantic ideal and the muddy, bloody, and financially stressful reality of their existence. Let's delve deeper into the daily routine of a knight, not on campaign, but in peacetime at his own drafty castle. His morning might start with hearing mass in his private chapel, a duty both spiritual and social. Then would come the business of the day, presiding over the manor court, settling disputes between his tenants about wandering pigs or property lines. He would need to inspect his fields, his mills, his forests, and his accounts with the help of a steward or reeve. The afternoon might be for practice, not the grand tourney, but the repetitive, grueling work at the quintain, a rotating practice target. Or it could be for hunting, which was both a sport and a vital way to put meat on the table. It was the life of a country squire and a CEO, a far cry from the constant adventure promised in the songs. The aftermath of the Great Emu War for Major Meredith is a sad little footnote. He and his men were the butt of jokes, but they were soldiers following orders. Meredith, in his final report, seemed genuinely bewildered and deeply impressed by his avian adversaries. He recommended that the birds be designated as an official enemy of the state and that military tactics be revised to include aerial bombardment. His suggestions were, of course, ignored. The event, while comical to the public, was likely a moment of professional embarrassment for him. It's a reminder that behind these absurd historical events are real people, just trying to do their jobs, who sometimes find themselves in situations that are far beyond their training or comprehension. The emus, in their own way, ended a military career. Your day begins before dawn, not with a call to adventure, but with the call of a horse needing its stall mucked out. The stench of ammonia and damp hay is the first thing you smell, and it will be the last thing you smell before you collapse onto your straw pallet. One of the most comical episodes of the Emu War involved a failed attempt at a mobile attack. The military command decided to mount one of the Lewis guns onto a truck, hoping to pursue the fast-running birds across the plains. The idea was to create a sort of primitive, Mad Max-style war rig. The reality was less than spectacular. The terrain was so rough, and the truck bounced so violently that the gunner was unable to get a steady aim. Meanwhile, the emus, unbothered by the bumpy ground, easily outran the vehicle. The only thing the soldiers accomplished was frightening the birds and wasting more ammunition. The image of a truck full of frustrated soldiers, bumping and rattling across a field in futile pursuit of a flock of birds, perfectly encapsulates the entire disastrous campaign. The social etiquette surrounding the fork's adoption is fascinating. As it slowly became accepted, a whole new set of rules emerged. Which fork do you use for fish? For salad? For dessert? The Victorian era in particular saw an explosion of specialized cutlery. A formal dinner setting could look like a surgical tray, with a bewildering array of forks, knives, and spoons for every conceivable food type. This wasn't just about function. It was about social signaling. Knowing how to navigate this complex cutlery landscape was a sign that you belonged to the proper class. The fork, once a symbol of rebellion against tradition, had become a tool for enforcing a new and even more rigid set of social norms. It went from being an outrage to being a requirement of polite society. Let's consider the resistance to the fork from a purely practical standpoint for a moment. For centuries, the main eating tools were a knife and a spoon. The spoon handled liquids and soft foods. The knife cut meat, which was then eaten with the fingers. A pointed knife could also be used to spear a piece of food and bring it to the mouth. So in a way, people already had a fork in the form of their knife point. The introduction of a dedicated, multi-tined tool for this purpose must have seemed redundant. Why carry and maintain a third utensil when the other two, plus your hands, did the job perfectly well? The cultural and religious objections were layered on top of a very simple, practical question. What is this thing actually for? The Voynich manuscript has sometimes been linked to famous figures of history in an attempt to ground its strangeness in a known context. One early theory, now largely dismissed, was that it was the work of the 13th century English philosopher and scientist Roger Bacon. Bacon was known for his work on ciphers and optics, so it seemed plausible. Another tantalizing but unsubstantiated theory connects it to a young Leonardo da Vinci as a kind of secret notebook. These theories are romantic and exciting, but they are based on wishful thinking rather than evidence. The manuscript's true author is as anonymous as its language. It resists being attached to a famous name, preferring to float free in history, a testament to the unknown, rather than the known, genius. Let's imagine the creator of the Voynich manuscript for a moment. Let's assume it wasn't a hoaxer, but a genuine scholar or artist. Who could they have been? Perhaps a physician frustrated with the limits of 15th century medicine, creating a symbolic system to explore the body in a new way. Or a botanist who traveled to a distant, unrecorded land and documented its alien flora. Or maybe an alchemist, using the coded language and mystical diagrams to record recipes for the philosopher's stone, hidden from the prying eyes of the church. Or perhaps just a lonely, brilliant person with a mind that worked differently from everyone else's, who created a private world on vellum to make sense of the universe. Each possibility is a little story in itself, a testament to the human drive to understand, to document, and to create. The horse was the knight's most important piece of equipment, even more so than his armor or sword. A knight's status was defined by his ability to fight on horseback. A warhorse, or destrier, was not just any horse. It was a massive, powerful animal, specially bred and trained for the chaos of battle. They were incredibly expensive, the medieval equivalent of a tank. Losing your horse in battle was a catastrophe. It not only put you at a severe disadvantage, making you a vulnerable foot soldier, but it was also a huge financial loss. Much of a knight's life revolved around the care, training, and protection of this single, vital animal. The bond between a knight and his steed was one of mutual dependence, a partnership forged in the stable and tested in the terrifying press of battle. Tournaments are often portrayed as the glamorous highlight of a knight's life, a medieval Super Bowl. While they were certainly popular spectacles, they were also incredibly dangerous and had a dark side. Early tournaments were essentially just mock battles, or melees, with few rules. Knights were frequently maimed or killed. They were also a place for settling scores and for a kind of legalized robbery. A victorious knight could capture his opponent's horse, armor, and even the knight himself for ransom. It was a high-stakes, high-risk sport. The joust, the one-on-one contest with lances, became more popular later as a slightly safer, more theatrical alternative. But even then, a splintered lance could easily find its way through an eye slit, with fatal consequences. A strange legacy of the Great Emu War is the respect the birds seem to have earned. The soldiers' own accounts paint them as worthy adversaries. The term Emu War itself, while mocking the military, also anthropomorphizes the birds, granting them the status of a belligerent nation. In Australian folklore, the emu is often portrayed as a cunning and resilient symbol of the outback. The war solidified this reputation. It's a rare case where the loser of a conflict, humanity, ends up writing the history in a way that glorifies the winner, the animal kingdom. It's a story we tell against ourselves, a charming narrative of our own fallibility in the face of the wild, untamable spirit of the Australian landscape. It's important to remember the context of the Emu War, the Great Depression. The world was in economic turmoil, and these farmers in Western Australia were on the front lines of that struggle. They were veterans who had been promised a new life, and they were watching that promise be eaten by birds. Their desperation was real. The government's decision to send the military, while absurd in hindsight, came from a place of wanting to be seen to be doing something to help. The story is funny because of its outcome, but its origins are rooted in genuine hardship and economic despair. The surreal nature of the war is a stark contrast to the very real and grim reality that these farmers were facing every day. The fork's association with masculinity, or the lack thereof, is a recurring theme in its history. From the Venetian clergy to the French and English courts, the tool was consistently derided as effeminate. This speaks volumes about the historical construction of gender roles. Manly eating involved directness, strength, and a certain disdain for fussiness, using a strong knife in one's own hands. The fork represented delicacy, precision, and an indirectness that was coded as feminine. It was a tool that created distance. The slow acceptance of the fork is tied to a slow change in the ideals of masculine behavior among the elite, where refinement and courtly manners began to be valued alongside brute strength. The fork didn't just change how people ate. It reflected a change in what it meant to be a man. The romantic notion of chivalry is a distant, glittering lie. Your reality is calloused hands, aching muscles, and the constant, nagging fear of doing something wrong. Your training is just getting beaten with blunted wooden swords until you learn to block. Imagine being at a dinner party in 17th century London. You are a worldly traveler, and you've brought your personal, Italian-made fork. You pull it from its case as the roast is served. A silence falls over the table. Your host raises an eyebrow. The other guests stare, a mixture of confusion and amusement on their faces. You carefully spear a piece of meat, and someone across the table lets out a snort of laughter. You would be the subject of gossip for weeks. Your simple act of using a utensil would be interpreted as a profound statement of arrogance and foreign pretension. This social pressure is a powerful force. It's what kept the fork at bay for so long. It's easy to dismiss, but the fear of being seen as strange or ridiculous is a major barrier to the adoption of any new idea or technology. One of the most persistent questions about the Voynich manuscript is whether it's a work of science or a work of magic. In the 15th century, the line between the two was incredibly blurry. A scholar studying the medicinal properties of plants, botany, might also be studying their astrological correspondences and their use in talismans, magic. An astronomer tracking the planets might also be a practicing astrologer, casting horoscopes. The manuscript, with its strange plants, celestial charts, and what look like alchemical diagrams, sits right on this fuzzy border. It could be a lost work of natural magic, a school of thought that sought to understand and manipulate the hidden forces of the cosmos. Trying to categorize it as either science or magic is to apply a modern distinction that its creator may not have even recognized. The future of the Voynich manuscript is as uncertain as its past. It currently resides at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, where it is one of their most requested items. It has been fully digitized, so now anyone in the world can scroll through its pages and try to unlock its secrets. Perhaps one day a breakthrough will come. A new linguistic tool, a newly discovered parallel text, or just a flash of insight from a lone researcher might finally provide the key. Or perhaps it will remain a mystery forever. There is a certain beauty in that possibility. In its silence, the manuscript challenges us to be comfortable with the unknown, to find wonder not in the answer, but in the enduring, beautiful question. Let's consider the end of a knight's life. If he wasn't killed in battle or by disease, he often faced a physically grueling old age. A lifetime of riding, fighting, and wearing heavy armor took a toll on the body. Arthritis, old wounds that never quite healed, and general wear and tear were common. The romantic image of the wise, old knight dispensing advice is tempered by the likely reality of a man in chronic pain. Furthermore, his position was only secure as long as he could defend it. A knight who became too old or infirm to fight could be vulnerable to younger, more ambitious rivals. It was a profession with no easy retirement plan. The final years could be a struggle to hold on to the status and land that he had spent his entire life fighting for. The religious life of a knight was full of contradictions. The church promoted the Crusades, sanctifying the knight's role as a soldier of Christ. Yet the core tenets of Christianity, humility, mercy, turning the other cheek, were in direct opposition to the daily reality of a warrior's life. How does one reconcile "thou shalt not kill" with a profession based on killing? Knights were often deeply pious, endowing monasteries and going on pilgrimages. perhaps as a way to atone for the violence of their work. They lived in a state of spiritual tension, caught between the demands of their faith and the demands of their feudal lord. This internal conflict, the struggle to be both a good Christian and a good knight, must have been a heavy psychological burden. One final thought on the Great Emu War: its scale. We hear war and think of massive armies and global conflict. This war consisted of 3 men, a truck, and 2 machine guns. The absurdity is amplified by the grandiosity of the name. It was officially called the Emu War in government files. This wasn't just a nickname made up by the press. The military and the government took it seriously enough to give it that title, which only makes the failure more delicious. It's a perfect example of bureaucratic language creating a reality that is completely disconnected from the situation on the ground. The file might say war, but the field said, a few blokes failing to shoot some birds. And in that gap lies the eternal comedy of the event. The Fork's journey is a story about disgust. The initial reaction to it was one of revulsion. It was seen as unnatural. The idea of putting a cold, hard metal object in your mouth, an object that looked like a tiny pitchfork, was viscerally unpleasant for people. Our sense of what is disgusting is deeply cultural and learned. Today, the thought of a whole table of people eating a greasy meal with their hands and then licking their fingers might seem disgusting to many of us. But for centuries, that was the norm. The fork had to overcome a fundamental, gut-level yuck factor. Its eventual triumph represents a complete reversal of what was considered clean and proper at the dinner table. It re-educated the palates and the sensibilities of the Western world. The Voynich manuscript is an interesting case study in the history of information. For most of its life, it was a physical object, accessible only to a handful of people who could physically hold it. Its secrets were guarded by its location as much as by its script. The digitization of the manuscript changed everything. Now, it is a global phenomenon. A teenager in Japan, a retired engineer in Brazil, and a university professor in Canada can all be studying the same page at the same time. This has led to a massive democratization of the research, an explosion of new theories, some brilliant, many crackpot. The manuscript has moved from the quiet archive to the chaotic, collaborative, and sometimes crazy world of the internet. Its mystery is now a collective project, a puzzle the whole world is trying to solve together. The romantic relationships of a knight were governed by the complex rules of courtly love, another literary ideal. The knight was supposed to choose a lady, often a married noblewoman of higher status, and dedicate his heroic deeds to her. This love was supposed to be pure, chaste, and ennobling. It was a game of glances, poems, and symbolic gestures. In reality, of course, things were much messier. Marriages among the nobility were political and economic alliances, not love matches. A knight's marriage would be arranged to consolidate land or forge a strategic bond. Courtly love provided an emotional outlet, a way to experience romance outside the practical and often loveless confines of an arranged marriage. But it was a dangerous game that could easily lead to accusations of adultery, jealousy, and deadly feuds. Let's consider the soundscape of a knight's life. It would have been a world of harsh, percussive sounds. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer shaping steel. The constant jingle and creak of leather and metal as he walked. The thunderous sound of a cavalry charge. A terrifying rumble of hooves and war cries. In his castle, it would be the echo of footsteps on stone floors, the crackle of a large fire in the great hall, the howling of wind through poorly sealed windows. It was not a quiet life. Even the moments of peace would be punctuated by the sounds of a working estate, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of farmhands, the distant ringing of a church bell. It was a world of raw, unfiltered sound. A stark contrast to our modern ability to curate our own auditory environment. Finally, you get your spurs. You're a knight. But the armor isn't a bespoke, gleaming masterpiece. It's a second-hand, ill-fitting collection of metal plates that weighs more than you'd care to admit. It chafes in places you didn't know could chafe. The failure of the Great Emu War led to a different, more agricultural form of warfare. The government, having failed with bullets, turned to barriers. In the years following the war, the state of Western Australia embarked on a massive project to build rabbit-proof fences, which were later reinforced to also become emu-proof fences. These fences stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the landscape, a monumental effort to separate farmland from the wild. It was an admission that you couldn't defeat the emus in open battle. You had to change the terrain. It was a shift from a tactical solution to a strategic infrastructural one. The fences stand today as a silent, rusting monument to the war, a testament to the fact that sometimes the best defense is, quite literally, a good fence. The fork is a tool of individualism. Before its widespread use, eating was often a more communal activity. People would eat from a shared central dish, a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread that acted as a plate, or a bowl. The introduction of the personal fork, along with the personal plate and glass, helped to create a sense of individual space at the dinner table. Your food was your own, in your own designated area. This shift mirrors a broader cultural shift in the West towards individualism. The table setting became a little map of personal sovereignty. The fork is a small but significant part of that story, a tool that helped to draw a line between mine and yours in one of the most basic human activities. The Voynich manuscript is a perfect illustration of the limits of pattern recognition. Both the human brain and AI are essentially pattern-matching machines. We look for repetitions, structures, and systems that we recognize. The manuscript seems to have patterns. It follows Zipf's law, which describes the frequency of words in natural languages. It has what looks like a grammar, but the patterns are alien. They don't match any known system. This is what makes it so frustrating and so fascinating. It teases our desire for order. It presents us with something that feels structured, but is semantically chaotic. It's like listening to a song with a clear rhythm and melody, but the notes are from a scale you've never heard before. It's music, but it's not for our ears. A knight's childhood was short. As a boy from a noble family, you would be sent away from home around the age of 7 to serve as a page in another lord's castle. This wasn't just an education. It was a political arrangement, a way of building alliances and securing loyalty. As a page, you were at the bottom of the social ladder. You would serve the ladies of the castle, learn manners, and begin basic weapons training. Around age 14, you would become a squire, a personal attendant to a knight. This was an apprenticeship. You cared for his armor, his weapons, and his horse. You followed him into battle, ready to assist him if he fell. It was a hard, demanding upbringing, designed to strip away the softness of childhood and forge a toughened, loyal warrior. The diet of a knight on campaign was a logistical nightmare. Armies had to be fed, and this was long before the age of canned goods, or MREs. The army traveled with a baggage train, a long, slow-moving procession of carts and animals carrying supplies. They also foraged, which was a polite term for taking whatever food they could find from the local countryside. This often made armies deeply unpopular with the peasants whose lands they crossed. The food itself was built for preservation, not pleasure. Salted pork and fish, hard biscuits, dried peas, and cheese were staples. Fresh food was a rare luxury. It was a monotonous, high-salt, low-vitamin diet that contributed to the poor health and disease that were rampant in any military camp. Let's consider the emus, post-war life. For them, nothing changed. The war was just a brief, noisy interruption to their seasonal migration. The soldiers left, and the emus went back to doing what emus do: eating, wandering, and avoiding the occasional farmer with a shotgun. The bounty system that followed was a more persistent threat, but the species as a whole was never in any real danger. They had faced a modern, mechanized army and had won through sheer, unthinking resilience. They remain a common sight in the Australian outback, a living, breathing reminder of one of history's most gloriously failed military endeavors. They are the unwitting, undefeated veterans of a very silly war. The fork's journey is also a story about class. For centuries, it was an elite object. Owning and using a fork was a clear signifier that you were part of the aristocracy or the wealthy merchant class. It was a way of distinguishing yourself from the common folk who ate with their hands. When industrial manufacturing finally made forks cheap and available to everyone in the 19th century, the elite had to find new ways to signal their status. This is when the explosion of specialized forks, oyster forks, pastry forks, fish forks, really took off. If everyone had a fork, the rich needed more forks. and more complex rules for their use to maintain the distinction. The humble fork thus became an arms race of etiquette, a battleground of social climbing fought on the dinner table. The connection between the Voynich manuscript and alchemy is a strong one. Alchemy was not just about turning lead into gold. It was a complex philosophical and spiritual system that used chemical processes as metaphors for spiritual transformation. Alchemical texts are famously symbolic and obscure, written in a secret language of allegory and code to protect their knowledge from the uninitiated. The Voynich manuscript, with its bizarre diagrams that could be interpreted as distillation apparatus, its unknown plants for elixirs, and its general air of secrecy, fits this mold perfectly. It could be a unique alchemical treatise, the personal workbook of a master of the art, detailing processes that were both physical and mystical. In this light, the unreadable text isn't a failure of communication. It's a feature, a deliberate veil of secrecy. The psychological impact of being a knight must have been profound. You were trained from childhood to suppress fear and to engage in acts of extreme violence. Today we have a much better understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. A medieval knight would have experienced the horrors of battle, the screams, the injuries, the death of comrades, with no psychological framework to process it. The expectation was to be stoic and fearless. Any sign of trauma would have been seen as cowardice or a failure of character. These men must have carried deep psychological scars, hidden beneath their chainmail and their stoic demeanor. The knightly ideal of the fearless hero denied the very real human cost of a life built on violence. Let's talk about the logistics of getting dressed as a knight. It was not a one-man job. A full suit of plate armor could have dozens of individual pieces that needed to be strapped and buckled on in a specific order. A knight would need the help of at least one squire, and probably two, to get fully kitted out for battle. It was a slow, laborious process. First came the padded undergarment, the arming doublet, then the mail shirt, the leg pieces, the arm pieces, the gauntlets, the breastplate, and finally, the helmet. It was like assembling a complex wearable machine, and once you were inside, your mobility was limited. Simple acts like getting up after a fall could be a serious challenge. The shining armor was also a prison of steel. The helmet is the worst part. It's a claustrophobic steel bucket that severely limits your vision and hearing. In the summer, it becomes a personal oven, slowly cooking your head while you stand guard and dream of a cool breeze. The Australian government's second response to the emu problem, after the failed military campaign, reveals a shift in thinking. The first time, the farmers requested the guns, and the government provided the soldiers to operate them. The second time Major Meredith's services were requested, the government said no. However, they did agree to lend the machine guns to the farmers themselves, provided the farmers paid for the ammunition and the transport. This is a subtle but important shift. The government was washing its hands of the direct responsibility for the war, turning it from a state-led military operation into a pest control issue for the farmers to handle themselves. It was a quiet, bureaucratic retreat, an admission that some problems are best handled locally without the pomp and circumstance of a military deployment. The fork's impact on the knife is an interesting side story. Before the fork, the knife was the primary tool. People had personal knives that they carried with them, and they were often sharp and pointed for both cutting food and spearing it. As the fork took over the job of conveying food to the mouth, the knife's role changed. It became solely a cutting tool. Over time, table knives became less sharp, and their points became rounded. The modern butter knife, with its dull edge and rounded tip, is the ultimate expression of this evolution. It is a knife that has been completely pacified. Its aggressive, spear-like qualities rendered obsolete by the triumph of the fork. The two tools evolved in tandem, each shaping the function and form of the other. One of the enduring mysteries of the Voynich manuscript is its provenance, its history of ownership. We know it was in the possession of Emperor Rudolf II's court in the early 1600s. But how did it get there? And where was it for the 150 years between its creation and its appearance in Prague? This missing period is a blank canvas onto which historians can project all sorts of theories. Was it hidden in a monastery library? Did it travel with a scholar from Italy to Bohemia? Was it part of a collection of some forgotten Renaissance prince? This gap in its history adds another layer to its enigma. The book is not just a mystery in its content, but also in its journey through time. It is a silent traveler, and we have only seen a few stops on its long, strange trip. Let's consider the concept of ransom, which was so central to a knight's career. When a knight was captured in battle, he wasn't typically executed. He was far too valuable. He was an asset, a source of potential income for his captor. The ransom amount would be negotiated, often based on the knight's wealth and social standing. This system turned warfare into a brutal form of business. It also meant that knights were often more focused on capturing other wealthy knights than on simply killing enemy soldiers. The goal was profit. This economic reality stands in stark contrast to the chivalric ideal of fighting for honor or for God. For many knights, war was a dangerous but potentially lucrative enterprise, a high-stakes gamble to improve one's financial situation. The castle was a knight's home, but it was far from comfortable. We imagine grand, beautiful stone structures, but the reality was often cold, dark, and damp. Windows were small slits, designed for defense, not for light or views. There was no central heating, only large, inefficient fireplaces that filled the rooms with smoke. Privacy was a rare commodity. The Great Hall was the center of life, where the knight's family, his retinue of soldiers, and his servants all ate and often slept together. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and roasting meat. It was a fortress first and a home second, a place designed for security and survival, not for the cozy comforts we associate with a house today. The public relations aspect of the Great Emu War is endlessly fascinating. The military was completely unprepared for the battle of public opinion. In a way, the war was lost not on the plains of Campion, but in the newsrooms of Perth and Sydney. The narrative of plucky birds outsmarting the army was simply too compelling to resist. It played into a classic underdog story, and the public loved it. This event occurred in an era when media was becoming more powerful and more irreverent. The Emu War was an early example of how a government or military institution could lose control of the story and become a victim of its own absurdity, amplified by a gleeful and witty press. The fork helped to change the very food that was eaten. Foods that are difficult to eat with your hands or a spoon, like salads with vinaigrette or pasta with a thin sauce, became more practical with a fork. The development of cuisine is linked to the development of the tools used to eat it. It's hard to imagine Italian food culture, with its incredible variety of pasta shapes, evolving in the same way without the fork. The tool didn't just change how we ate, it opened up new possibilities for what we could eat. It's a quiet reminder that technology, even something as simple as a piece of bent metal, can have a profound impact on culture, shaping everything from our manners to the food on our plates. One of the most beautiful and frustrating things about the Voynich manuscript is its aesthetic quality. The script is elegant and consistent. The drawings, while bizarre, are rendered with a confident and artistic hand. It is a beautiful object. If it is a hoax, it is a masterpiece of a hoax. If it is a real text, its beauty adds to the tragedy of its incomprehensibility. We can appreciate its form, but we are denied its content. It's like looking at a stunningly beautiful stained glass window that depicts a story we will never know. The beauty of the manuscript is what draws us in, while its silence is what keeps us there, forever wondering, forever captivated by its elegant, impenetrable mystery. The role of women in a knight's life was complex. His wife, the lady of the castle, was not a passive figure. When the knight was away at war, which was often, she was in charge. She would manage the estate, oversee the defenses, and even command the garrison if the castle was attacked. These noble women were often formidable administrators and leaders in their own right. The romanticized damsel in distress of chivalric literature was a far cry from the capable, powerful women who ran the great households of medieval Europe. A knight's marriage was a partnership, and his wife was often the anchor that kept his world from falling apart while he was off on his military adventures. A knight's relationship with the law was also complicated. As a feudal lord, he was the law in his own domain. He presided over the local court and dispensed justice. However, he was also subject to the authority of his own overlord, the baron, duke, or king. The medieval legal system was a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions and customs. A knight had to be a skilled political operator, navigating this complex web of loyalties and obligations. A legal dispute could be as dangerous as a battle, and a misstep could lead to the loss of his lands and titles. The sword was the ultimate tool of enforcement, but a shrewd understanding of law and custom was essential for long-term survival.